Part 25. So, they were the protagonists all along. Author, CCC. Chapter 242. As night fell, the Lianji sect became a little lonely. After reaching the soul refining realm, it was no problem for the cultivators not to rest, but generally at this time, most cultivators would choose to meditate and practice. Not far from the south bank was a cave. At this time, in a villa, Regina was leaning on a chair in the study, holding a book in her hand and reading leisurely. Behind Regina, an old man appeared silently behind her. Regina crossed her left leg with her right leg, held her cheek with her hand, and glanced at the old man behind her. "I know what you want to say, but I have my own plan here." "Nijiti is very puzzled by what you did today," the old man said slowly. "So," the sickly young lady pursed her attractive lips and said nonchalantly, "did you come to me because of Nigiti's matter?" The old man shook his head slowly and said, "I just want to know why the young lady protected Musian today." Nanhuang sent Nigiti and Regina this time, naturally confident in their strength. But now the Ascension Conference has not even started, and the two of them have such a thing because of an outsider, which is inevitably a bit worrying. 3 Emperor-level medicinal herbs, even if you search all over Jizhu, there are probably no more than 10 of them. Because of this, Nanhuang must get the Emperor-level medicinal herbs. As a result, it has just been a short time since he arrived at Lianji sect, and such a thing happened. It is no wonder that it gave the accompanying elder a headache. The old man stared at Regina's clear silver eyes and said slowly, "I know that the young lady has her own ideas. You have made almost no mistakes in your decisions in the southern wilds in the past. However, the young lady should also know the importance of the 3 imperial-level medicinal herbs." "I know." Regina smiled gently and used her little finger to lift a strand of hair hanging down from her ear behind her ear. This action is extremely elegant, and it is even more prominent on Regina. "However, Musian's current importance ranks first in my heart," she continued. "Why dash?" The old man was about to ask when he heard Regina whisper something. The old man was stunned at first, then his eyes slowly widened, with a hint of joy in his eyes. "Saint, are you serious?" The physique of the saints of the southern wilds in all generations is the soul-reading body, and before the Hedeo realm, they all have the side effect of weakness. Even the 3 pillars of the southern wilds can't solve this problem. Even if all the several imperial-level medicinal herbs in the southern wilds are given to Regina, this feeling of weakness will still exist. Despite this weak side effect, Regina is still unrivaled among her peers and swept away a group of geniuses. She is the last genius who hopes to break the rules of heaven and earth and enter the realm of enlightenment. If what Regina said is true, Musian can really make her soul-reading body complete. As long as she can enter the realm of unity in the future, her strength may exceed the current 3 pillars. When he thought of this, the old man took a breath slowly and said, "I know. I will explain to Nigiti." He paused and continued, "Did Musian say when to trade with you? And, how to trade?" Regina only said that Musian had a way to further evolve her physique, but did not say that Musian was born with a furnace. "After the Ascension Conference is over," Regina said. The old man frowned slightly, obviously knowing what Musian was thinking. However, the other party's trading time is reasonable. But it's said that after the Ascension Conference is over, emotional problems are sometimes beyond your control. A faint arc appeared at the corner of Regina's lips. Tianchen glitting, no wonder the leader of Lianji sect agreed to the bet so straightforwardly that day. With Musian, the Taoist partner beside him is probably much more powerful than most people imagine. "I will find a time to contact him again in the next few days." Regina gently put down the book in her hand. If possible, it would be the best choice to take him back to Nanhuang after the Ascension Conference is over and let him stay with her in the future. The old man nodded slightly, and then suddenly said, "By the way, miss, I heard that the shock in Dongzhou this morning was due to the birth of the Sword Palace." "Sword Palace?" Regina frowned slightly and whispered to herself, what a coincidence. Tianhe Garden. It was dark at night. Musian sat in the room, holding a cup of tea in one hand and looking at the maid in front of him with a look of satisfaction in his eyes. As if she was a little uncomfortable being stared at, Wei Mengru's usually cold face was now blushing. She subconsciously pressed the hem of her skirt and looked at her master coldly with contempt. Have you seen enough? Musian was stunned. We have just started, how can we see enough? While speaking, he couldn't help but look at Wei Mengru twice more, and couldn't help but sigh in his heart. Stockings are really one of the most amazing inventions in the world. At this time, Wei Mengru had changed into another set of clothes under Musian's instructions. The light yellow double-breasted small shirt with beautiful patterns set off her figure to the fullest, and her round and white long legs were wrapped in black and white silk, which just perfectly matched the hem of her skirt. Although they are two different colors of stockings, black and white, they do not look out of place at all at the moment. Instead, they add a more attractive beauty. Is this the bet you're talking about? Wei Mengru asked coldly. Musian smiled and nodded, taking a look outside the window at the leaves in the courtyard that were being blown gently by the wind. The weather has turned cold recently, and I only took this step for the sake of Sister Mengru. Wei Mengru obviously didn't believe it and just gave him a sideways glance. Why are you staring at me like this, Sister Mengru? Musian put down the teacup gently and admired the humiliation of the maid at this time. This is Nirvana silk. I just want to test whether the effect is good. What do you think? My misunderstanding may be a bit deep. Wei Mengru took a shallow breath and exhaled slowly, as if she was trying to adjust her inner shame. Then he raised his eyes and stared at him, and said, then what? What else do you need me to do? Although she is Master Mu's maid, Wei Mengru is obviously arrogant. If she loses the bet, she loses, and she will not cheat. However, from the beginning, the looks that Musian cast towards her, intentionally or unintentionally, still made Wei Mengru feel a little uncomfortable. After all, he had been secretly protecting Musian from the shadows all year round. When Musian was still a playboy, he never even said a few words to him. It was the first time that the two of them were alone in the same room like tonight. Musian did not answer, but took a sip of tea slowly, and then looked at Wei Mengru with admiration. Probably because she had been stared at, Wei Mengru's porcelain-like beautiful face was already blushing with a lovely blush. Her thin yellow skirt wrapped the beauty's delicate body. She turned her face away slightly, her white neck showing a graceful arc. Under the candlelight, you can vaguely see the delicate and attractive collarbone under the jade neck. The legs wrapped in stockings are stretched out a little, which adds a bit of allure to the perfect golden ratio of the legs. It's a pity that there are no high heels in this era, otherwise it would be a dead end. Musian will inevitably feel a little regretful. Maybe he could consider designing it himself and then ask someone to do it. When he thought of this, he couldn't help but feel a little bit impatient. Wei Mengru's rosy little mouth opened slightly and said, if there's nothing else to do, I'll leave first. In the end she couldn't hold it any longer. In the past, she just watched with cold eyes how her young master flirted with girls, but she had always had the mentality of watching a show. As a result, when she became the character in the drama, she didn't know what to do. If she had known earlier, she shouldn't have agreed to this bet. Wei Mengru suddenly regretted it. I also knew that Musian must have been confident in mentioning the bet at that time. But the content of the bet that Musian said at that time made her a little interested. Don't worry, you won't rest anyway, so why not sit down and have a cup of tea and chat for a while? Musian motioned to the chair next to him. If it were normal, the maid would probably just give him a look of disdain and then leave the room lightly. But the bet wasn't over yet, so she could only suppress the shame surging in her heart, and said as calmly as possible, do you have any other instructions? Pour me a cup of tea first. Musian tapped his fingers on the table and said. After Wei Mengru poured the tea, she spoke again, What next? However, as soon as he opened his mouth, he found that Musian's eyes were falling directly on him, as if he was admiring some rare gem in the world. Wei Mengru's eyes were still cold, but there was a deep sense of shame hidden deep in her eyes. Seemingly aware of Wei Mengru's eyes that seemed to be more full of disdain than usual, Musian came back from his thoughts, pondered for a moment, and said with a smile, "Next, please ask Sister Mengru to serve me. Have some tea." Wei Mengru picked up the teacup and placed it in front of him, and said in a somewhat stammering tone, "Please, please drink tea." At the end of the sentence, Wei Mengru looked at her young master with a deep chill in her eyes. "It's not good. Sister Mengru is already like this before I play with her. If I really ask her to lift up her skirt and step on it with a look of disgust, I think she will die together with me." Musian felt the almost freezing air around him and silently took a sip of tea to calm down his shock. Then, he gently put down the teacup in his hand and sighed, "Okay, that's it." Wei Mengru glanced condescendingly at Musian, who was sitting on the tea chair, and said, "Don't you need me to do anything?" "No need." Musian shook his head. Then he sighed sincerely, "In fact, at first I just wanted to have a heart-to-heart talk with Sister Mengru." Wei Mengru glanced sideways, "Just for a simple heart-to-heart talk, you want me to wear these stockings?" Her voice became softer and softer, as if she was recalling the scene where her young master was admiring her figure, so that after looking at him for a few times, she inadvertently looked away. "And if you don't go to Miss Bai if you want to talk, what are you going to do with me?" Musian first raised his head and stared at Wei Mengru's beautiful plain white profile, and then after a short silence, he sighed heavily, "To be honest, when I was in Yaokai that day, I really thought I was going to die. At that time, I was thinking about all the things that happened during my lifetime and whether there were any unfinished regrets." Wei Mengru's eyes moved slightly, as if she was thinking of what happened in Yaokai before. She rarely spoke, and just listened to Musian's words quietly. "I thought of many, many people at that time, including Sister Mengru." Of course, Muji settled down. "The biggest regret that came to my mind at that time was that it seemed that Sister Mengru and I had never had a good talk. Heart. Wei Mengru likes to hide in the darkness and guard her young master silently, and rarely speaks." Musian did think about Wei Mengru at that time. However, not having a good chat is only part of the reason for the regret. Another part of the reason was that he didn't see the maid lifting up her skirt and staring at him in shame until the end, which made Musian feel a little regretful. "So I also want to take advantage of this opportunity to have a good chat with Sister Mengru. I don't have any bad intentions." When Musian said the last word, he stared at Wei Mengru's flawless side face and said softly, "This bet, from the very beginning, I plan to use it to have a heart-to-heart talk with Sister Mengru. Tonight may be a very unpleasant night for you, but for me, it can be regarded as a satisfying one. Pity. If something happens to me next time, it will be fine." Wei Mengru's eyes flashed slightly, and she moved her jade neck subconsciously, as if she wanted to look back at Musian, but she held back due to some complicated emotions in her heart. Still maintaining a cold demeanor, the room seemed a little quiet. At this time, Musian stretched out a hand and held Wei Mengru's soft, slightly cold hand. Wei Mengru subconsciously wanted to withdraw her hand, but Musian's strength was much greater than expected. If she relied solely on her own strength without using spiritual energy, it would be difficult to break free. In the end, she simply stopped trying to break free and just maintained her cold Balian posture. The condition of Musian's bet tonight was for her to obey her master's orders like a real maid, and her current action was probably considered a bet. Wei Mengru herself was a little unsure. "Sister Mengru's favorable impression of me is indeed not that bad." Musian looked at Wei Mengru's slightly pursed lips and her cold but non-resisting expression, and felt a little clear in her heart. He did not make any more excessive demands, he just took Wei Mengru's delicate hand, then lowered his head and kissed the back of her hand. Feeling a slight moist feeling on the back of her smooth hand, Wei Mengru's eyes widened slightly, and finally she couldn't help but subconsciously turned her head to look at Musian. He just raised his head and showed a faint smile. "Sister Mengru, good night." After the maid left, Musian took another sip of tea alone in the room, and then sighed with regret. Originally, he wanted Sister Mengru to do something more sentimental tonight, however, in the end, reason prevailed over impulse. He has to think about the future. If Wei Mengru is asked to wear black and white silk stockings this time and play something interesting, maybe she will agree after being extremely ashamed, but it is hard to imagine what will happen after that. But if we can take this opportunity to enhance the relationship between master and servant, maybe we can do something sentimental every day in the future. Musian still knows very well how to choose between having fun once and having fun again and again. Go to Ruoxi's place to meditate and practice. Musian thought to himself after taking a look at the sky outside. Ruoxi's heavenly energy can quickly purify spiritual energy and use it for his own use, and he can also use Ruoxi's heavenly energy to improve his cultivation faster. And when Musian was about to get up and leave, he suddenly felt a hazy blue figure outside the window. Musian stood up and came to the window. It was winter and the night was even colder, but Yao Meng was still wearing a thin green skirt with a graceful back curve. When the cold wind blew, a small section of slender snow-white calf seemed to be vaguely exposed. Jade feet are white and crystal clear. She is like a ghost, her feet do not touch the ground, and her snow-white skin is tinged with silver. She is like a fairy who has just descended from the Guanggan Palace, giving people a sense of sanctity and inviolability. As if aware of Musian's gaze, Yao Meng glanced at him slightly, with a faint curve at the corner of his mouth. "Is there any problem with Jian'er?" Musian sent a message. "She and the reincarnated queen are both in seclusion." "There is no big problem." Yao Meng also transmitted the message. Then in the next moment, he appeared in the room silently. Teleport. Musian was obviously stunned for a moment. Looking at the faint smile in her charming eyes, he couldn't help but ask, "Has your spiritual energy been completely restored?" Yao Meng slowly shook his head and said softly, "It will take some time." In order to avoid affecting the vitality of Dongzhou, Yao Meng did not choose to directly convert all the aura and vitality in Dongzhou into his own aura, but adopted a gentler method to absorb the aura. As for this gentle method of absorbing spiritual energy, it actually requires someone to suffer to complete it. The room seemed a little quiet at the moment. Yao Meng stood with his head bowed, his hair flowing like a waterfall down to his calves, making his skin even whiter. Under the thin green skirt, some of the luster of the skin could be vaguely seen. Even when she was inside the house, her toes still did not touch the ground. She was clearly close in front of her eyes, but she still gave people a feeling of an extremely far distance. Musian stepped forward, reached out and pushed the hair away from her forehead, and then stared lovingly into her magnificent blue eyes. "The Tiansheng furnace has almost recovered. Let me continue to help you." Yao Meng tilted her head slightly, her eyes and eyebrows smiling, and her pleasant voice sounded softly in Musian's ears, "Aren't you worried about being discovered by your girlfriend?" Just the sound made Musian feel itchy, and he wanted to see her shy expression on her face on the bed. "Ruoxi will understand, everything is for the fairy sister and for the prosperity of Dongzhou," Musian said righteously. Afterwards, he stopped talking, but bent down and picked up Yao Meng's soft fairy body, and then walked to the bed in her cold and charming eyes. "Go to bed." So, they were the protagonists all along. Author, CCC. Chapter 243. The next morning, Musian woke up early, stretched his body lazily in front of the courtyard, and felt the first ray of sunshine in the winter morning. No, rather than waking up, it is better to say that he did not sleep at all last night. Or there was no chance to sleep. But there was nothing he could do about it. Yao Meng needed a lot of spiritual energy, and all of this spiritual energy had to be obtained from him. Of course, the fairy would not ask Musian to do something too much without restraint. Maybe she was thin-skinned or something, and basically every time Musian took the initiative, she acquiesced to Musian's behavior. To this day, the relationship between the two seems a little subtle. Obviously, Yao Meng's purpose at the beginning was simply to reshape the cauldron and the immortal body, but from the recent reactions, the two are more like a close Taoist couple. After resting in the courtyard for a while, Musian quietly walked into Bai Ruoxi's room. Miss Bai, who was wearing a white palace dress, seemed to have been practicing for several cycles. The energy of the heavenly Dao continuously transformed the mixed spiritual energy in the air into pure spiritual energy, and those spiritual energies were quickly absorbed by her. Musian did not disturb Bai Ruoxi, but found a place to sit cross-legged by himself and began to meditate and practice. Before the latest news from the Sword Palace came out, they did not need to be too anxious. After all, Lianji sect was not too far from Swanyan Palace, and the location of the Sword Palace was 100 miles away from Swanyan Palace. It was still in time to wait for the latest news from the Sword Palace. It was almost the same as what Musian expected. In the afternoon of the next day, a more shocking news spread all over Dongzhou. Hundreds of cultivators tried to break through and enter the Sword Palace. Except for a few people who took advantage of the chaos to enter the Sword Palace, the rest of them were not spared. After that, a cultivator entered the Sword Palace unscathed and was not attacked by the lightsaber on the surface of the Sword Palace. This news, like a shot of adrenaline, excited many monks who had given up on the Sword Palace. Shortly after that, the identity of the monk was investigated. The young master of Ganyuan Pavilion, who was rumored to have great sword skills, went to the Sword Palace alone after the elders of Ganyuan Pavilion cast a layer of protective spell on him. I thought it would be a thrilling battle, but the lightsaber in the Sword Palace did not react at all, but let him enter directly. This is a very incredible thing. In the past 2 days, many monks have wanted to step into the Sword Palace for the treasures in the Sword Palace, but they were killed and smashed. As a result, the young master of Ganyuan Pavilion entered the Sword Palace without any hindrance, which was really a bit strange. In the afternoon of the same day, another news came out: the Yaokai fairy of Yaokai Holy Land also entered the Sword Palace unscathed. A stone stirs up 1,000 waves. This news spread to all parts of Dongzhou, making some ancient families a little restless. After discussing with the elders of the clan, the young generation of the proud sons of heaven immediately set off for the Sword Palace. They seemed to be afraid that if they were a little later, the treasures in the Sword Palace would be taken away. At the same time, in Tianhe Garden, Bai Ruoxi also slowly opened his eyes. "Is the meditation over?" Musian asked with a smile. Bai Ruoxi smiled and nodded first, then stared into Musian's eyes and said, "Just now the bronze fragment reacted, it seemed to urge me to go to the Sword Palace." Musian showed a faint smile on his face. It seems that the Sword Palace is indeed waiting for Bai Ruoxi. However, why did the bronze fragment react to Bai Ruoxi? Could it be that the Bai family is the descendant of the Sword Palace master? Musian had such a guess in his mind. Then, he quickly shook his head and stopped thinking about it. Well, when we go to the Sword Palace this time, the answer will be revealed naturally. Yayu slowly opened his eyes from meditation. Finally, I have stabilized in the second level of the soul refining realm. He slowly exhaled a breath of turbid air, feeling refreshed. It's not a bad thing to lose to Nigeti this time. Your mentality and will are much better than before, the old man in Yayu's body said with a somewhat relieved tone. I didn't lose to Nigeti. If he hadn't cheated in the end, I would have won the alchemy competition. Yayu was quite disdainful. It's good that you can see it through, the old man answered slowly, with a little more emotion in his heart. With his current mentality, it shouldn't be a big problem to reach the return to Void Realm. The old man continued, it doesn't matter if we didn't get the recipe for the 9 cauldron pill this time. After all, The recipe is dispensable, but the good things in the Sword Palace can't be missed. Sword Palace, yeah, you frowned slightly. The Sword Palace that the teacher is talking about refers to the heavenly palace that just emerged from the ground recently. Yes. The old man slowly said, the palace master of the Sword Palace is a wonderful woman. She loves to practice swords since she was born, and the ordinary long sword that accompanied her in the past also resonated with the great Deo when she merged with the Deo, and nurtured a weapon spirit. It is rumored that when the sword comes out, no one in the same realm can take it head on. If you can get it, your chances of winning at the Ascension Conference may increase by more than 30% or 40%. Is that sword still in the Sword Palace? Yayu's eyes suddenly became more eager. Then, he said doubtfully, but isn't there a rumor these past 2 days that all the monks who tried to enter the Sword Palace were blasted into powder? Could it be that the teacher has a way to enter it? The teacher has no way, but you can enter the Sword Palace yourself, the old man said again. As if knowing Yayu's doubts, the old man spoke again. Ganyuan Pavilion is famous for swords, and the young master of Ganyuan Pavilion naturally also has a very high talent for swords. I don't know much about the Yaokai Holy Land, but the Yaokai Saint Girl is probably also very talented in swords. What does the teacher mean? Yayu seemed to have thought of something, but he was not sure. The Sword Palace is looking for its master, the old man said with a somewhat certain tone. The reason for the Sword Palace to be born this time is still unknown, but the reason why the Sword Palace declined in the past was because no one could use the bronze ancient sword left by the Sword Emperor. Those who can enter the Sword Palace without being attacked this time all have extremely high sword talents. As for the reason, I think there is only one. Yayu's eyes slowly lit up a little. Is the bronze ancient sword in the Sword Palace looking for a suitable owner? The artifact has a spirit, not to mention the bronze sword that has been with the Sword Emperor for many years. From the past to the present, the sword has never had a suitable owner. This time, the Sword Palace was born, probably because it sensed a suitable owner. After all, this is a golden age, and all kinds of geniuses have emerged. It is not surprising that there are people who can be recognized by the Sword Palace. With my sword talent, the bronze sword is bound to be obtained. Yayu's eyes rekindled the fire, and he clenched his fist slightly. If he gets the recognition of the Sword Palace, his strength will not be as simple as going to the next level. The blessing of an ancestral artifact is far beyond people's imagination. By then, at the Ascension Conference, no matter if it was Musian or Bairuoxi, or even the so-called geniuses from the southern wilderness and western regions, they would all be killed by that sword. Teacher, I want to set off for the Sword Palace today, Yayu said in his heart. That's the best, the old man answered slowly. On the other side, the third elder in the southern wilderness put his hands behind his back, staring at the handsome young man in front of him, and slowly said, Nigeti, the young lady told me yesterday about what happened to you after you made the elixir. Don't ask about it anymore. The young lady has her own plans. Nigeti seemed a little afraid, and said, did the young lady explain the reason? For a cultivator from Dongzhou, she didn't hesitate to turn against him, the person she was traveling with this time, and even completely ignored his feelings. If there is no legitimate reason, it is really difficult for people to calm down their anger. The third elder looked at Nigeti meaningfully and said slowly, the lady didn't say it, but I believe her judgment. Regina's physique is extremely special, and she made a deal with Musian. When the Ascension Conference is over, the lady's physique will be complete. This matter is of great importance, so naturally no more people can know it. However, Nigeti was obviously unwilling, and suddenly raised his head and looked at the third elder. Elder, is this a little unfair to me? The third elder snorted coldly. If you want to know why the lady protected Musian yesterday, then you can ask her yourself, and I won't stop you. Nigeti heard this, his eyes flashed with anger, and finally he just slammed heavily on the wall behind him. It was really impotent and furious. There was nothing he could do about it. With Regina's physique, in the southern wilds, only those who were at a higher level than her could barely resist this bloodline suppression. When the southern wilds cultivators of the same level saw Regina, they only felt awe in their hearts and it was difficult for them to resist. I asked about Musian yesterday. He is a guy who likes to deceive women with sweet words. Miss, please don't be fascinated by him and forget our purpose. Nigeti could only say this stubbornly. I know my limits, the third elder said with a smile. Regina looks like a very docile and weak girl on the surface, but in fact, she is more arrogant than anyone else. What can a little cultivator of the third level of spiritual cultivation use to attract the young lady? However, we still need to pay a little attention. After all, the young lady's physique is too restrained by the cultivators of the southern wilderness. If Musian really succeeds, I'm afraid the three gods will be restless. In addition, there is another thing that is also a bit worrying. The third elder looked up at the direction of the Sword Palace, with a bit of worry in his turbid eyes. This time, if someone really gets the ancestral weapon from the Sword Palace, the Ascension Conference may have variables. But now, we can only hope that no one can get the recognition of the Sword Palace. The third elder sighed in his heart and retracted his gaze. Tianhe Garden. A. The sad and melodious voice of Ling Long, like the beautiful singing of a siren in the sea, came from the other garden, as if she was complaining that Musian did not bring her breakfast in the morning and made her hungry. Dong dong. Musian held the plate in one hand and knocked on Miss Ling Long's door with the other hand. In the room, Lin Ling lay on the table, swinging her white feet, slightly tilting her head, and staring at Musian with a pair of red eyes. To be precise, she was staring at the meat bun in Musian's hand. After Musian brought the meat bun to her, Lin Ling took the meat bun and took a bite silently. Sister Lin Ling, I may have to leave Tianhewen for 2 days. Then you can only find food by yourself for the time being, Musian said while stroking Lin Ling's soft silver hair. If someone saw this scene, they would probably be so shocked that their jaws would drop. In the past, Ling Long rarely left her cave, and even in Lianji sect, few people had seen her. As a result, Musian seemed to treat Sister Ling Long as a cat at home and was still stroking her hair. When she heard that Musian was leaving, Lin Ling immediately raised her head, her bright eyes flashed with reluctance, and she tilted her head slightly and asked, "AAA. The Sword Palace was born, and Sister Men grew, Ruoxi, and I plan to go and see it. There may be the last piece of bronze fragment of Ruoxi there," Musian explained. In fact, Wei Mengru should have stayed, but Musian was a little worried that when he came back, Wei Mengru would have something wrong with her luck, so after repeated consideration, he decided to go together. Lin Ling blinked, and there seemed to be some thoughtfulness in her eyes. Then, looking at Musian who seemed to be about to leave, she seemed a little worried, and opened her red lips slightly, saying, "Live." That voice seemed to be full of some kind of magic, which aroused the resonance of the great Dao. Musian suddenly felt a warm feeling filling his body. He subconsciously turned his head to look at Lin Ling, but saw that she was holding up the cardboard. It will allow you to heal quickly once when you are seriously injured, and this spell will be automatically lifted within 7 days. The power of words is indeed ridiculously strong, and this is still under the restriction of the energy of the heavenly Dao, otherwise Lin Ling's strength is simply unbelievable. Musian looked at the silver-haired and red-eyed beauty who was holding up the cardboard cutely, and sighed in his heart, and then he solemnly thanked her. The Sword Palace is outside the Lianji sect, and it is difficult for normal cultivators to approach. If something unexpected happens inside, naturally no one can blame anyone. At this time, Lin Ling's words are very useful. If the injury is serious, it can be cured directly once, it is equivalent to one life beating 2 lives. After bidding farewell to Lin Ling, Musian walked out of the room and came to the courtyard. Wei Mengru had been waiting in front of the courtyard for a long time. It seemed that it happened last night. The maid looked at Master Mu with a little more ease today than before. She no longer looked at him with the same eyes as before. This made Musian feel relieved and regretful. The relief was that the relationship between him and the maid had taken a step forward, and the regret was that he seemed to like being stared at by the maid with that kind of contemptuous eyes. "Where is Ruoxi?" Musian greeted. There Wei Mengru raised her chin and pointed to the beauty in the white palace skirt sitting in front of the courtyard. Then, she couldn't help but look at Musian again and said, "We must be careful this time. There are not only dangers in the Sword Palace, but the monks in the Sword Palace may not all be kind." "I know." Musian smiled gently. "However, we are just going to drink some soup this time. The rest has nothing to do with us," he continued. "Drink some soup?" Wei Mengru, who was still unaware of the situation, looked at Musian with some doubt in her eyes. Musian smiled and said, "The cultivators outside thought that the Sword Palace let people in this time to choose a master. But in fact, the Sword Palace has already chosen a master. You are listening to Novels at Bless Up channel. Wish you happiness and luck. Please subscribe to receive new novels. How do you feel about this novel? Please like and leave a comment." So, they were the protagonists all along. Author, CCC. Chapter 244. The Sword Palace is located near the Swanyan Palace. It is in a quiet environment with lush green mountains and forests. At this moment, in the depths of the Swanyan Palace, a man stood in front of the palace with his hands behind his back, quietly gazing at the vaguely visible palace in the sky in the distance. Since yesterday, many cultivators have tried to enter the Sword Palace. However, up to now, at least more than 20 cultivators in the refining spirit realm have been killed by lightsabers. As for the cultivators in the Return to Void realm, they simply don't have the opportunity to set foot. As long as the cultivators in the Return to Void realm approach the Sword Palace, the 108 lightsabers surrounding the Sword Palace seem to be ready to move. This also directly discouraged those cultivators in the Return to Void realm who were planning to approach. Obviously, the Sword Palace is choosing a master, and the cultivators in the Return to Void realm do not meet the requirements of choosing a master. At this time, a servant behind him asked tentatively, "Palace Master, should we send someone to take a look? The Sword Palace is just near the Swanyan Palace. If they want to take some actions to enter the Sword Palace, they will be much faster than other cultivators from the outside world." However, the Palace Master of the Swanyan Palace has never made any movement from beginning to end, which makes people a little unbelievable. The man came back to his senses from his thoughts just now, and immediately shook his head and said, "Not necessary for the time being. The things in the outside world have nothing to do with us. Other forces in Dongzhou are interested in the Sword Palace, let them go. Compared to this, I care more about another thing." The man turned his head to look at the servant and said slowly, "I asked you to send a letter to Lianji sect a few days ago. Have you responded?" The man's name is Linjing, the palace master of Swanyan Palace, and one of the top forces among the ancient families in Dongzhou. Some time ago, he heard the elders in the hall mention that the Qing Emperor's reshaping of the cauldron may be related to a little monk, so he wrote a letter and sent it to the Lianji sect's library. As for the reason, it was naturally related to his daughter Lin Qiu. Before the Swanyan body returned to the Void realm, the body was weaker than ordinary people, and it might catch a cold and fever at any time. Although his daughter had a very high talent, she had been tortured by the Swanyan body since childhood. And Musian's natural furnace and cauldron can complement it. Musian is a disciple of the master of the library. He, the master of the Swanyan Hall, happens to have some friendship with Yan Ruyu. If Yan Ruyu is asked to speak up and act as a matchmaker, after that, perhaps the problem of his daughter's Swanyan body can be solved. The attendant hesitated for a moment after hearing this, and said, "Master Yan has not replied yet." Linjing nodded slightly and said, "This matter is of great importance. Yan Ruyu has never accepted a disciple from the past to the present. This time she accepted Musian as a disciple, and I think she likes him very much. It is indeed necessary to reconsider it. After all, this is a marriage between a man and a woman. Even Yan Ruyu, as a master, has to discuss it with her own disciple. However, in terms of status and position, his daughter is not unworthy of Musian. If Musian knew about this, let alone whether he would agree, at least he would come to Swanyan Hall to meet them, and he would not refuse. "Where is Kiu?" Lin Jing suddenly asked. "She is still in the room and has not left," the attendant beside him said respectfully. Lin Jing sighed slightly. Since knowing that he wrote a letter to Lianji sect, Lin Qiu has been throwing a tantrum and locking herself in the room to meditate all day long. According to her own opinion, marriage matters should be decided by herself, not by her parents. After learning that the letter written by Lin Jing contained the meaning of proposing marriage, Lin Qiu no longer paid attention to him as a father. "Sooner or later, the young lady will understand your good intentions," the attendant said flatteringly. Lin Jing waved his hand and said, "You go down first. If Yan Ruyu has a reply in 2 days, tell me." After that, he put his hands behind his back and planned to walk into the depths of the hall. At this time, a spy behind him hurriedly came and said anxiously, "Master, the young lady is missing." Lin Jing turned his head suddenly and looked over. Just now, a clan member saw her enter the Sword Palace, but it was too late to stop her. The spy continued. "Should we send someone to try to enter the Sword Palace?" the attendant asked tentatively. Lin Jing was silent for a moment, then sighed lightly and waved his hand. "Forget it, you all go down." In the past, the girl rarely left Swanyan Palace. This time, it was probably because of the marriage that she wanted to do some rebellious actions. In that case, let her go. Sword Palace. This is a palace suspended under the sky. It is extremely huge, and the surface is made of indestructible black gold stone. 108 Sharp blades of light illuminate this ancient palace, making many cultivators near the Sword Palace both envious and fearful. From today on, many cultivators are almost certain that the Sword Palace is choosing a master. It is choosing its own master, and the inheritance in this Sword Palace, and even the ancestral sword left by the Sword Emperor, are likely still in the Sword Palace. The ancestral weapon left by the powerful in the Hedeo realm, plus the inheritance of the Sword Emperor, a large amount of resources, skills, and even the Sword Palace itself, all of these are irresistible temptations. It's just a pity that only cultivators with sword talent can set foot in it. As long as the rest of the cultivators have any movement to get close, they will be smashed to pieces by the sharp blades of light surrounding the Sword Palace. This also makes many people feel a little regretful. At this time in the air, many cultivators are flying with swords, or are eager to try whether they can enter the Sword Palace, or chatting about the Sword Palace. There are at least more than 10 proud sons of the ancient family who entered the Sword Palace this time. If someone really gets the recognition of the Sword Palace, it will be a big profit. A cultivator couldn't help but sigh. "Hey, you have seen the danger of the Sword Palace. It's so dangerous just outside. If you really enter the Sword Palace, you can't guarantee what dangers there will be. It's not that easy to get the recognition of the Sword Palace. Who knows, all the cultivators who entered the Sword Palace may not pass the test, and they can't get out. If so, Dong Zhou will probably be in chaos." A cultivator next to him couldn't help but sigh. Most of those who can enter the Sword Palace this time are the descendants of the top ancient families, and these descendants will be geniuses who can inherit the ancient families in the future. If they really fall in the Sword Palace, it is unknown how much noise they will cause. "Look, it seems that someone is not afraid of death and flies over again." At this time, someone suddenly pointed at the 3 figures in the air and said, "There have been too many monks who were killed in the past 2 days for wanting to enter the Sword Palace." Seeing the monks who fell one after another, all the monks have calmed down. These 3 people are monks who just came from outside, so they are so reckless. Tisk, 2 of them are beauties, What a pity! When a monk saw the yellow and white beauties flying swords, he couldn't help but sigh secretly, and his eyes fell on the sword palace's sharp blade of light. Today, the monks who rashly wanted to enter the sword palace were almost killed by the sharp blade of light when they were close to the sword palace. The blades of light didn't react. This means that they should also be recognized by the sword palace, the monk suddenly said. Everyone looked up and saw that in front of the sword palace, the 108 blades of light remained motionless, allowing the three people to fly into the sword palace. This also means that the three people have passed the first level of the sword palace test and can officially enter the sword palace. Those who can enter the sword palace are basically the pride of some ancient families. For a while, there was a whisper outside the sword palace about the identities of these three people. Inside the sword palace, Musian and others who had already entered the sword palace naturally didn't know what happened in the outside world. He looked around the layout of the surrounding environment at this time, and couldn't help but sighed. I didn't expect it to be so easy to enter the sword palace. I thought I would be intercepted at first. At first, he thought that his sword talent would not be recognized by the sword palace. After all, his heaven was jealous of talents, and it was not his talent that was jealous, but his natural furnace physique. Therefore, Musian never thought that he had a high talent in combat. Maybe, I, the auxiliary, can also be the C, Musian thought to himself. Then, he turned his head to look at Byruoxi beside him and said, Ruoxi, does the bronze piece have any other reaction? Byruoxi was wearing a clean white dress, and her full and upright chest was proudly supported. At a glance, she was unfathomable. After hearing Musian's words, Byruoxi never made any sound, but just lowered her head, as if in a daze. Ruoxi, Musian reached out and gently rubbed her delicate face, which brought Byruoxi back to reality from the daze just now. Ah! What's wrong? Byruoxi raised her head in confusion. What's wrong with you? Something seems to be wrong since you entered the sword palace. Musian looked at Byruoxi with concern. Are you feeling unwell? Byruoxi shook his head gently and smiled reluctantly. It's okay, I just felt like there was a woman's voice echoing in my mind from the beginning, making me feel uneasy. Voice? Musian's eyes moved slightly. Do you know what she said? Byruoxi shook his head and said, the voice is gone now, I can't remember what she said. The woman's voice, could it be the palace master of the sword palace? Musian shook his head quickly and stopped thinking about it. Anyway, let's go in and take a look. Since we are here, we can't be sure if we will be attacked by the lightsaber outside if we leave rashly. It's better to go in and take a look. If there is really any problem, just crush the jade slip and leave. Yesterday, just in case, he asked Yao Menduo to make a jade slip, and the three of them each held one. If there is really any problem, they can leave immediately. The three of them walked slowly into the hall of the sword palace. This is more like a palace courtyard than a hall. There are flowers everywhere, and none of them have withered. They are of different colors, competing for beauty, and extremely beautiful. Musian walked in this courtyard, observing the flowers around him. For some reason, he felt a chill. He thought of something very strange. Why are there still living flowers in a sword palace that has been around for tens of thousands of years? It stands to reason that even the disciples of the sword palace should have disappeared in the dust of history. Or is it that someone is still alive and taking care of the flowers every day? He quickly shook his head and didn't dare to think any further. Not far away was a huge rockery with a few big characters engraved on it. The Hall of Inquiry. After leaving the courtyard, they walked along the bottomless corridor. They walked for nearly half an hour, but they still couldn't get out of the corridor. It's a bit strange, this sword palace doesn't look very big from the outside. How can this courtyard be so big? Musian stopped and felt something was wrong. Logically speaking, many people should have entered the sword palace. Where did they go? Wei Mengru was also a little confused and observed the surrounding environment. Then, She suddenly pulled Musian's sleeve gently and pointed to the rockery in front. Musian looked up and saw 3 big characters engraved on the rockery, the Hall of Inquiry. Musian's heart jumped slightly and realized something. From the beginning to the end, they have been wandering in the same place and have never left this place. It seems that the test has begun since we entered the Sword Palace. Musian quickly calmed down, and then he and Bairuoxi and Wei Mengru observed repeatedly in this courtyard for a long time, and finally saw countless sword pictures carved behind the rockery. Musian's eyes moved slightly, and his natural spirit body was incisively and exquisitely at this time. He suddenly said, "This rockery is stained with some spiritual energy of cultivators, it should be left by the cultivators who just came in not long ago. It seems that the secret should be on this rockery. However, why is there spiritual energy of cultivators on the rockery?" Musian pondered for a moment, and suddenly thought of something. He stretched out his hand to touch the rockery, and then tried to inject a wisp of spiritual energy into it. The next moment, the first sword carved on the rockery lit up silently. As expected, this rockery itself is one of the tests of the Sword Palace. When Musian thought of this, the second and third swords lit up one by one, and each sword shone with golden light. The appearance of these lightsabers was exactly the same as the 108 lightsabers outside the Sword Palace. Finally, this light continued until the 90th sword and then stopped. At the same time, a line of small words on the rockery also quietly appeared. Ranking of Sword Talent, 26th. This should be the stone tablet used by the Sword Palace to test the talents of disciples in the past, and before the death of the Sword Emperor, he used it as one of the tests to test future generations. After the test, the sound of a door quietly opening suddenly came from the courtyard. Musian looked at the bottomless room and said to himself, "Dong Tian. Behind this door is a cave. It seems that the cave may be the subsequent test of the Sword Palace." He did not enter it directly, but stood aside waiting for Wei Mengru and Bairuoxi to finish the test. Besides, he was still very concerned about Wei Mengru and Bairuoxi's sword talents. Wei Mengru stretched out her palm and gently touched the stone tablet. The first sword, then the second, the third, and even the 50th sword, and finally, the light stopped in front of the 86th sword. At the same time, the sound of another door opening sounded quietly. The 108 sharp blades of light engraved on this stone tablet, could it be that the difficulty of passing the level will also be different depending on the degree of resonance? Musian looked at Wei Mengru's delicate and cold profile, and secretly had some guesses in his heart. "What's wrong?" Wei Mengru, who seemed to have noticed Musian's gaze, glanced at him, feeling a little uncomfortable being stared at. Musian came back to his senses, shook his head and smiled, "It's okay, I just didn't expect that Sister Mengru's sword talent is not as high as mine. But it's true that Wei Mengru's talents in other aspects such as formations are top-notch. If even her talents in swords are also top-notch, how can other geniuses survive? Ruoxi, you try it too." Musian turned his head and looked at Bairuoxi. Bairuoxi nodded slightly, and then under the gaze of the two, he walked forward gracefully, stretched out his white wrist from his sleeve, and gently touched the stone tablet with his slender hand. The first, the second, the third, the 30th, the 60th. The light on the stone tablet lit up one by one like dominoes, and Musian's eyes never moved away from Bairuoxi. If the person called by the Sword Palace was really Bairuoxi, maybe all the swords on the stone tablet could resonate. If so, I don't know what will happen. Musian looked at the scene with expectation in his heart. Time passed silently, and when it was close to the 90th sword, the speed at which the lightsaber on the stone tablet lit up had gradually slowed down. Is Ruoxi's talent similar to mine? It shouldn't be. Musian couldn't help but doubt. At the same time, the monks in the outside world also looked up. When they saw the lightsabers lighting up one by one, they couldn't help but secretly compare them with the geniuses who had entered before. It seems that the 108 lightsabers on the surface of the Sword Palace are connected to something in the Sword Palace and are used to test the monks. I remember that not long ago, a disciple of the IE sect entered it. He resonated with 103 lightsabers. It was really terrifying. The daughter of the master of the Swanyan Palace is also among them. I wonder how many swords she has resonated with, someone said with a somewhat curious tone while looking at the 97 lightsabers in front of them. Couldn't help but sigh. There are really many geniuses who have entered the Sword Palace this time. From the looks of it, among the 3 people just now, there are also some who can break through the bottleneck of 100 swords. If it resonates 108 times, could it be that we can truly get the inheritance of the Sword Palace? Someone couldn't help but said with a somewhat teasing tone. As soon as these words came out, someone immediately showed a faint smile. 108? Even only the Sword Emperor himself can do it. They have all looked away. Since the Sword Palace requires sword talent to enter it, it is destined to be missed by monks like them who major in other ways, so they can only watch the show here. Breaking through 100, a monk suddenly said. The next is the most critical time. The slower the lightsaber resonance is, the slower it goes. Most of the monks with sword talents in Dongzhou have probably already entered it, right? However, the highest number only has 103 lightsabers. If you really want to get the Sword Palace inheritance, you really need to light up 108 lightsabers at the same time, then these proud people will probably have to go to waste this time, someone next to him said with a gloating tone. Snort. There was a cold snort immediately from the side, and an elder from the ancient family who was guarding the place gave the man an indifferent look. The person who originally made fun suddenly fell silent. But I still feel a little dissatisfied, even gloating about my misfortune. It would be interesting if no one really could get the Sword Palace inheritance this time. It seems that we have reached 103 after watching the lightsaber's resonance speed stop for nearly a cup of tea. A monk finally spoke to break the silence. That's already very impressive. I don't know what the identities of those 3 people just now were, but there was someone with such a monster talent among them. People were chatting and trying to look back. However, at this moment, the lightsaber that had been stagnant suddenly lit up again. The eyes of countless people froze slightly, and the chatter just now fell silent instantly, and countless eyes stared at the Sword Palace in mid-air. Someone resonated with the 104th lightsaber. There was no time for anyone to react, only a boom was heard. Under the eyes of countless people in disbelief, the 108 lightsabers that were originally silent on the surface of the Sword Palace completely lit up at this moment, blooming with endless energy. Less dazzling than the sun. Almost at that moment, there was a thunderous sound in people's hearts, and the same thought flashed through their minds at the same time. Someone has been truly recognized by Sword Palace. Meanwhile, on the other side, Musian also looked at the stone tablet that was completely lit up at this time with some amazement, and looked at Bairuoxi who was illuminated by the golden light like a goddess descending, and couldn't help feeling a little more emotional. Although I had just vaguely guessed that Bairuoxi might be able to resonate with the 108 swords, when I actually saw this scene, I was still a little shocked. Bairuoxi never spoke, she just raised her head and looked at the stone tablet in front of her, with a hint of surprise in her eyes. Ruoxi, what's wrong? Musian saw something was wrong with Bairuoxi's state and couldn't help but ask. I feel like someone is calling me, Bairuoxi suddenly said. Under Musian's gaze, Bairuoxi turned her head slightly, looked at a door not far away from her that had quietly opened at some point, and said softly. That voice came from there. So, they were the protagonists all along. Author, CCC. Chapter 245. Is there anyone still alive in the Sword Palace? When Musian heard Bairuoxi say this in such a confident tone, he felt his scalp tingling. You know, how long has the Sword Palace been established? And it has never been born in the underground cave. Although the cultivators after the refining spirit realm can maintain their energy by relying on spiritual energy even if they don't eat or drink, is there really anyone who can stand the loneliness and stay in the Sword Palace for such a long time? Anyway, let's go in and take a look. After a brief thought, Musian made this decision. Originally, their purpose of going to the Sword Palace was to get Bairuoxi's third bronze fragment. It's impossible to back down at this time. I hope it's not another old demon. If possible, I still prefer fairies like Yao Meng. After all, compared to the powerful old demon, it's better to have a powerful, beautiful, busty and long-legged sister, isn't it? While thinking about this, Musian and the two walked into the door that had quietly opened at some point. However, when Bairuoxi stepped into it, Musian found that he seemed to be blocked outside by a barrier and could not get close. It seems that everyone can only enter the cave that has just been opened after passing the test. Musian looked at Bairuoxi in the door and understood it slightly. Seeing that Wei Mengru was also blocked outside the door, Musian had to look up at Bairuoxi and said helplessly, "It seems that we can only accompany you here." Then, he continued, "Remember Ruoxi, everything is safety first. If there is any problem, just crush the jade slip and leave. We don't necessarily have to get the third bronze fragment now. Mulang should also be careful. If it doesn't work, leave the Sword Palace first and wait for me," Bairuoxi said softly. Then, her eyes fell on Wei Mengru and she said, "Sister Mengru, I'll leave him to you for the time being." Why did this sound strange? It felt like brothers inherit the father's business. Am I a bus? After Ruoxi uses it, Sister Mengru will use it. Musian couldn't help but complain in his heart. Bairuoxi naturally didn't know what Musian was thinking. After taking a deep look at Musian, she turned around and walked into the cave that was open only to her. On both sides of the dark corridor, sword lights lit up silently, as if welcoming its new owner to enter. Bairuoxi walked slowly along the illuminated sword light into the depths of the corridor. Musian had protected her so many times, and in the past he had encountered a lot of trouble because of his own affairs. After this, it was her turn to protect Musian. Use her sword and the heart locked together. As the door quietly closed, Musian also withdrew his sight and said, "Let's go to the other two caves that have just been opened. Maybe we can gain something." Wei Mengru nodded slightly and followed her master silently. If you don't look carefully, you won't even notice that she is hiding behind Musian, because Wei Mengru is invisible to the naked eye at this time. In addition, her realm is enough to crush everyone among her peers. People with lower realms than hers naturally find it difficult to detect her existence. After stepping into the cave that had just been opened for him, Musian turned his head and looked at Wei Mengru again, saying, "Can Sister Mengru enter it?" Wei Mengru nodded slightly, "It didn't stop me. It seems that only the cave where Ruoxi is located is the most special. No one except her can get close. As for other caves, there is no such restriction." When Musian thought of this in his heart, he walked into the door that was opened for them with Wei Mengru. The courtyard was quiet, with only the flowers in the courtyard swaying in the wind, charming and enchanting. Just after entering the cave, Musian vaguely sensed a special breath. He looked up and saw a mountain with strange rocks in the distance. There was only one cave entrance at the foot of the mountain. And around the cave entrance, there were nearly 100 strange rocks, each with a different color and shape, and from the stones, Musian felt a special breath. Is this the so-called spiritual mine? Musian guessed. In the world of cultivating immortals, there are many shapes and even types of spiritual mines, such as some high-quality blood spiritual stones, white shining spiritual stones, etc., which are usually only the size of a fingernail and are worth a normal 100,000 spiritual stones. And these special spiritual stones are often mined from the spiritual mine mountain. To be more precise, they are cut from the spiritual mine. Is this the reward of the Sword Palace for those who pass the first test, or a trap? Musian is a little unsure. Although he was somewhat tempted, Musian did not rush in. After approaching the cave entrance, he used his spiritual sense to scan the area around the cave entrance to confirm whether there was any formation. After a brief spiritual sense confirmation, Musian was relieved. There is no formation, let's go and take a look. Waymengru followed Musian and soon came to the cave entrance covered with all kinds of strange rocks. There were such spiritual mines everywhere. Musian touched one of the spiritual mines with his hand and soon felt the special spiritual energy contained in the stone. Obviously, there was a special spiritual stone hidden in this stone. Musian once again checked the other strange rocks nearby and found that every strange stone carried the same ray of spiritual energy. If all these stones are cut open and the special spiritual stones are taken away, I'm afraid you can be directly promoted to 1 or 2 levels. Waymengru was a little surprised. You actually tested me with so many rich spiritual minerals, who can withstand this? Musian couldn't help but sigh. Natural spirits are born with an excellent affinity for the spiritual energy between heaven and earth. This is not only effective in alchemy, but also in searching for enemies, absorbing spiritual energy in battle, and even in cutting stones like this. Good physique. Under normal circumstances, ordinary people cannot use their spiritual sense to confirm whether the spiritual mine is good or not, but the natural spiritual body can roughly distinguish it. If Ya Lingxian, the true master of the natural spirit body, were to come, she would probably be able to directly pick out the best spiritual ore from the hundreds of spiritual ores. It's a pity that Sister Lingxian is still receiving the inheritance. Mu Jian could not help but feel a little regretful, and he was about to reach out and touch one of the spiritual mines. However, just as his fingers touched the surface of the spiritual mine, he suddenly noticed that there seemed to be a fierce aura coming from the horizon. Waymengru reacted almost immediately and immediately became vigilant. Musian raised his head and saw a beautiful white figure slamming into the ground like a meteorite. Boom! A slight vibration sounded, and Musian reacted very quickly, taking a few steps back before the figure hit the ground. Then he lowered his head and glanced at the girl who hit the ground. What the hell, a heroine descended from heaven. Of course, this was just Musian's complaint. Although the woman who appeared in the field of vision was indeed a beauty, she was obviously trying to avoid some kind of pursuit and was running away in such a panic. The layer of protection on her body that shone with a faint white halo quietly dissipated, and what appeared in the field of vision was a somewhat unfamiliar girl. She was wearing a pink and white skirt with a waistband, and small embroidered shoes on her feet because of her escape. But one of them was lost. At this time, his legs were slightly tilted, and a trace of blood spilled from his slightly pale lips. The girl was obviously seriously injured. Her chest was stained red with large swaths of blood, her hair was messy, and blood and sweat stains slid down her forehead. When Musian saw her, he thought of one person, Regina. Although there is probably no connection between the two, the girl's temperament is similar to Regina's, and both have a somewhat sickly feel. I remember that the daughter of the master of Swanyan Palace has a rare Swanyan body, so she was born weak. Could it be her? When Musian was speculating on such a thing, the girl had already reluctantly raised her head with her sword in hand. There was a bit of wariness in her dark eyes, and she whispered softly, "Who are you?" As she spoke, she subconsciously grasped the hilt of the sword in her hand. Under her guarded eyes, there was more weariness and regret. If she had known that the outside world was so dangerous, she would never have left the Swanyan Palace and headed to the Sword Palace alone. No, it is not external things that are dangerous, but the human heart. In the past, Linkia would never have imagined that the big brother next door who treated her like a real brother in her past would be so ruthless and decisive this time. If it weren't for the fragments of the ancestral artifact that her father left in her body, I'm afraid she would have been killed by now. But in the end, if it weren't for this ancestral artifact fragment, they wouldn't be chasing him. Lin Qiu couldn't help but reveal a self-deprecating smile, thinking that after she died, the other party would pretend that she encountered an accident in the Sword Palace, and even pretend to comfort her sad father. Just thinking about this, the girl's heart was filled with hatred and anger. Can't die yet. At least Dad should know the true face of that person. Just when she thought of this, the girl heard an understatement asking in front of her, "I should be asking you this, who are you? Look like you are being hunted." The girl raised her eyes, which were already somewhat blurry. She bit her lower lip as hard as she could, as if to maintain her last bit of consciousness, and said concisely, "Fellow Taoist, if you leave the Sword Palace this time, please report to the master of the Swanyan Palace that the young master of the Qianyuan Pavilion took away my ancestral artifact fragments and pretended that I encountered an accident in the Sword Palace. It seems, after informing you of this, my father will definitely give you a heavy reward." Yes, her spiritual energy is almost exhausted now, and it is unrealistic to escape from the Sword Palace. However, she can ask someone to convey her words to the Swanyan Palace. As long as Dad knows about this, he will not be deceived by the people of Qianyuan Pavilion in the future. "Your dad?" Musian seemed to be a little more interested and asked, "Are you Lin Qiu, the daughter of the master of Swanyan Palace?" As he spoke, a talisman burned quietly in his hand, and at the same time, Musian's eyes turned into a magnificent pale gold. Qi gazing technique. Using the talisman of this Qi gazing technique, he could tell whether the girl in front of him was lying. "Do you know me?" Lin Qiu suppressed the consciousness that was about to faint, bit her lower lip and looked straight at Musian. Although she looked miserable at this moment, it was not difficult to see that she was a pampered young lady. Whether it was her delicate temperament or her flawless white face and moist and gentle eyes, they all proved this. "I've heard of it," Musian smiled. Lin Qiu's eyes flashed with joy, and she endured the pain and said, "What do you think of the proposal just now? If you can tell my father about this, he will definitely reward you handsomely." She had no intention of surviving now, but as long as she could expose the hypocritical masks of those people, it would be worth dying for. "I don't think it's very good," Musian smiled. Before Lin Qiu showed a look of disappointment on her face, Musian took out a pill and handed it to her. "Take it, and then go back and tell your father yourself." He didn't want to get involved in the fight between these big forces, but it was impossible to leave the girl alone at the moment. As for the reason, it's not just because of the so-called kindness, but Mr. Mu is a good man who knows how to cherish women. Now there are high-quality fish fry, so it doesn't matter if he saves them. After all, he won't lose anything by helping them, so why not? Lin Qiu showed a helpless smile on her face and said, "My cauldron is now shattered. Even if I rely on ordinary pills to treat my body, I will die sooner or later due to the exhaustion of spiritual energy. If you don't agree, it's fine, but it's better not to waste this pill." When she said this, she looked at the pill in Musian's hand again, and suddenly froze for a moment, and subconsciously looked at the boy in front of her again. "Huiwen pill. Huiwen pill, that is a special pill that can slowly repair the cauldron for the seriously injured and give spiritual energy, and one of its medicinal ingredients is only available in Lianji section." Lin Qiu's eyes flickered slightly, and she stretched out her hand with difficulty and fed the Huiwen pill into her mouth. Then, she raised her eyes with hope and looked at Musian, saying, "Are you a disciple of Lianji sect?" Musian just smiled gently and said, "You are seriously injured and can't talk now, so just rest and recover. Don't resist for a while, I will let you enter my cave for a while, and then send you away." After Musian finished speaking, he raised his hand and waved it, and a scroll appeared out of thin air, directly sucking the seriously injured girl into the scroll. 8 Desolate Dream Map. The effect of Huiwen pill almost took effect quietly, and while being sucked into the 8 Desolate Dream Map, the girl's body, which was originally tense, slowly relaxed. When she was about to faint, she looked at Musian again. When her father arranged a marriage for her without authorization, the girl who had a pink love fantasy flatly refused her father on the grounds that she wanted to encounter a Taoist partner herself. This time, she ran away from home without permission and was targeted. When she was attacked and hunted by people from Ganyuan Pavilion in the Sword Palace, she regretted it for a while. But now it seems that it is not all bad, at least she did meet a good person in the end. I forgot to ask his name. Lin Qiu's eyelids became heavier and heavier, until finally, she slowly closed her eyes and immersed herself in the 8 desolate dream map created by Musian. This 8 desolate dream map is really useful. It can be used as a small cave with you. Musian looked up at the scroll that disappeared in the air and sighed from the bottom of his heart. Aren't you most afraid of trouble? Why did you save her? Wei Mengru suddenly asked. Musian sighed lightly. I can't sit idly by and watch people in trouble. He Wei Mengru immediately gave a contemptuous look. Knowing some of Musian's past operations, how could she believe what he said now? It's easy to imagine that Musian was probably moved by the girl's good looks. Wei Mengru curled her lips in disdain. Musian naturally didn't know what the maid was thinking at the moment. At this time, he had quickly restrained his emotions and focused his attention on the spiritual minerals in front of him. After scanning with his spiritual sense and carefully selecting for a while, Musian finally chose a spiritual mineral that he thought had the most spiritual energy. Musian wrapped the spiritual energy with a sword and slowly cut it open. After cutting the spiritual mineral that was as big as a human head, only small translucent green gems were seen, each of which was only the size of a fingernail, and there were a total of 7. If I remember correctly, this seems to be an emerald leaf stone, and each one is worth about 30,000 spiritual stones. Musian turned his head and looked at Wei Mengru behind him and asked. Wei Mengru just took a look and nodded gently. It is indeed the emerald leaf stone. She did not ask about the daughter of the master of the Swanyan Palace just now, because she knew that her young master had his own plan for every action. 210,000 spiritual stones, not bad. Musian pondered for a moment and planned to choose another stone to cut. However, this time, as soon as his fingers touched the spiritual ore, they were separated by a layer of invisible things. Musian did not believe in evil, and tried 2 or 3 more spiritual ores, but he could not touch them again. It seems that everyone can only choose one spiritual ore to take away, Musian said to himself, but he was relieved in his heart. If all these spiritual ores could be taken away, it would make him feel a little uneasy. After all, suddenly picking up a lot of spiritual stones for nothing would feel a bit wrong to anyone else. Wei Mengru's eyes moved slightly. The maid was quite interested in this feeling similar to lottery. She stretched out her hand and tried to touch the spiritual mine, but was not blocked like Musian just now. When Musian saw this, his eyes couldn't help but fall on Wei Mengru. He was quite curious about what kind of spiritual stone Wei Mengru could cut out. Under Musian's gaze, Wei Mengru smashed the spiritual mine she chose into pieces, and what came into view was only an empty spiritual mine with nothing in it. After all, she is Sister Mengru, so this is quite normal. Musian understood the situation and tried to keep a calm expression to avoid laughing out loud. Wei Mengru glanced at him lightly, naturally knowing what her young master was thinking. She just curled her lips and said, "Want to go in and take a look?" When he said this, his eyes fell on the hole in front. Musian nodded slightly and said, "We're already here." Ruoxi sighed, "Shouldn't be that fast yet. Let's go in and take a look first." He was also a little curious about what was hidden in the cave. There are already so many spiritual minerals accumulated at the entrance of the cave alone. Are there more spiritual minerals in this mountain peak? As Musian and Wei Mengru walked into the cave entrance, everything around them became a little dark. For the monks, the dark environment did not have much impact on them, and everything in front of them was clearly reflected in their field of vision. They walked along the bottomless cave entrance and saw a mural almost every once in a while. In the mural was a woman wearing a long skirt. Her temperament was gentle and weak, but when she held a sword in one hand, she was exuding an awe-inspiring temperament. In the mural, it seems to be a scene of a woman fighting some monster. There seem to be a lot of murals in the entrance of the cave. They should all be scenes from the Sword Palace in the past, right? Time is indeed ruthless, and nothing was left here in the end. Muzian couldn't help but sigh. Wei Mengru glanced at Muzian coldly and said, "When you say such words, let go of your hand first." Sure enough, using this emotional method, there is still no way to secretly hold Sister Mengru's hand. Muzian regretfully let go of Wei Mengru's hand just now. "I just thought that in this dark environment, it would be easier for us to hold hands and be less likely to get separated," Muzian explained. Wei Mengru just gave him a look of disdain and was too lazy to talk to him. Monks are not afraid of darkness at all. They can see things clearly even in the dark. How could they not see clearly just because the environment is dim? This reason can only deceive some little girls who have never experienced it. Huh. At this time, Muzian suddenly grabbed Wei Mengru's soft, cold hand again. Before the maid could get angry, Muzian pointed at the mural in front of him and said, "Sister Mengru, look at that mural. Is it similar to the scene you saw in front of the restricted area?" Wei Mengru subconsciously raised her head and looked. What is depicted in the mural is a little girl wearing a simple robe, walking among the ruins everywhere. And there seemed to be some writing engraved on the dilapidated building. Texts that do not belong to the Dacian dynasty. Muzian took a closer look and said to himself, "It is very similar to the picture you saw in the mirror in the forbidden ancestral land before, but it seems that the dynasty is different." Before Wei Mengru left the restricted area, she used the mirror in her ancestral land to conduct a test. That mirror could reflect a person's past life and future. The scene in the picture at that time was a little girl walking alone among the ruins. The same is true for the mural in front of me. However, Muzian remembered that the writing he saw at that time was different from the writing dynasty in the mural now. These should be two dynasties. The Sword Palace has a long history. It probably witnessed the decline of a dynasty in the past. After that, the scene was carved in this cave in this way. Muzian had a guess in his mind. If the master of the Sword Palace is still alive, he may be able to know what dynasty this is and who the little girl in the mural is. When Muzian thought of this, he couldn't help but secretly sigh with regret. It's a pity that although the Sword Palace is still there, everything in the Sword Palace has long been obliterated by time, not to mention the magnificent master of the Sword Palace. The mural just now contained a scene about the Lord of the Sword Palace, so Muzian had a general understanding of the appearance of the Lord of the Sword Palace. What a pity for such a great beauty. Muzian shook his head, and after writing down the words in the mural, he continued walking deeper. There seemed to be a faint commotion ahead. Muzian and Wei Mengru glanced at each other. They shielded their own auras in a tacit understanding and walked quietly into the depths of the cave. "Yeah, you, do you really think I'm afraid of you? If it weren't for the overall situation, I would kill you right now." The person who spoke was a young man in gorgeous clothes. He was carrying a long sword and was staring at Yayu with hatred. Opposite the young man was a young man in black robes who looked slightly thin. Yayu. The two obviously had some conflicts. In addition, there were 5 or 6 monks standing aside with their arms folded, as if they were planning to watch a show. Yayu smiled faintly. "If you have the ability, just come directly. If not, just cooperate with us to unlock the secret of this bronze door. As for how much of the treasure inside can be obtained, it depends on everyone." "How dare a second-grade god refiner dare to point fingers at me?" The young man laughed angrily, and not far from the young man, another monk seemed to be ready to make a move, and seemed to be on the young man's side. "Why is someone coming here again?" At this time, a monk suddenly noticed Muzian, who had just walked in, and couldn't help but whisper. Although Muzian blocked his aura, the people present were not bad in strength, and they were even more alert in this environment. so they were naturally directly aware of his presence. The young man and Yayu looked at each other almost at the same time, and at that moment, Yayu's eyes narrowed slightly and he said word by word, "Musian." After the words fell, several monks present were slightly moved. They had never met Musian, but the people present were all the proud sons of various ancient families, and they had occasionally heard the elders of the clan mention Musian before. It is said that the reason why the restricted area was launched a few days ago and the investigation of traitors in various ancient families was caused by the death of Musian. Of course, compared to this absurd statement, the major ancient families are more willing to believe that the birth of the Qing emperor made the restricted area unbearable. After all, Musian, whose backstage is not particularly large, should not have so much energy. "Why are you here?" Yayu stared at Musian and said coldly. "This area must have resonated with at least 80 lightsabers before you can step into it. Your sword talent is also that high." The young man who had a conflict with Yayu not far away was equally unbelievable. "It's just good luck," Musian smiled. No one spoke in the cave, but the eyes of a few people looking at Musian were a little more unkind. In order to enter this cave, they had stepped on many traps along the way. Now they finally reached the end, but someone followed them and planned to share the results with them, which was naturally unpleasant. "Fellow shepherd, there is no place for you to get involved here. You'd better leave for now," a young genius monk advised in a friendly manner. Obviously, they don't want more people to share this result. Although they still don't know how to open the bronze door behind them. "Fellow Mudeo, if you don't plan to leave, we can only ask you to leave. But the sword has no eyes. If you get hurt here, you can't blame anyone," someone on the side also said coldly. In addition, 4 people chose to remain neutral and did not speak. They just looked at it coldly and did not intend to interfere in this matter. Musian showed a thoughtful look and said, "In other words, you think that I will take away the treasure when I come here, so you want to drive me away." "It doesn't matter if you think so," someone said coldly. At this time, the young man who had previously clashed with Yayu smiled and cupped his hands, saying, "Fellow Taoist Mu, I am the young master of Qianyuan Pavilion, Qian Chen. We did not intend to conflict with you, but, we have stepped on many traps in this cave for the treasure along the way, and it is naturally unacceptable for fellow pastors to enjoy the cool weather in the back. If you leave like this, we won't care about what happened just now," Qian Chen said with a smile. "Is Jian Palace your home?" Musian asked with a smile. Qian Chen was startled for a moment, and then said, "Although it's not the case, but dash. If not, can you tell me to send it?" These simple and crude words made Qian Chen, who had spoken before, suddenly turn gloomy. "Qian Chen, don't talk nonsense to him, just drive him out," a monk next to Qian Chen said. "Since Master Mu won't listen to his good words, I can only ask you to leave here," Qian Chen said with a bit of coldness in his eyes, and he rushed towards Musian's direction. At the same time, another young monk beside him also attacked Musian. Yayu's eyes flashed slightly, staring at the scene closely, but did not take action. Compared with Musian, he cares more about the treasure behind the bronze door behind him. It would be better if these 3 people can die together. If not, the spiritual energy of Qian Chen and the other person can be consumed. This will be more important for him to fight for the treasure in the future. Favorable. The 5th level of God refining, and one is the 6th level of God refining. Musian looked at the 2 people who were attacking, with a bit of admiration in his eyes. It should be said that he is worthy of being a descendant of the ancient family, and his talent is really nothing to say. There were 2 people who took action, not including Yayu who was about to make a move next to him, and the monks who seemed to be neutral. These neutral monks may shoot a cold arrow at any time. Under normal circumstances, it would indeed be difficult to deal with so many monks in the God-refining realm. However, they didn't seem to realize it. There were others behind him. Qian Chen appeared in front of Musian, with a fierce look in his eyes, and the sword wrapped in spiritual energy slashed towards Musian, and behind him, a figure holding a sword also appeared. The creature held the sword and made the same move as Qian Chen. Musian raised his hand, and a green lotus bloomed quietly. Gan Chen felt that his spiritual energy seemed to disappear in an instant. He didn't have time to think about it and wanted to retreat immediately. However, at this time, there was an extremely strange formation under his feet. Boom! The next moment, the formation burst into a huge flame, directly covering Gan Chen. A figure in a yellow skirt appeared silently. When Gan Chen just broke free from the formation, Wei Mengru had already swung her sword forward. Under the guidance of the aura, the sword in her hand burst out with spiritual energy higher than that of everyone present. At the same time, another cultivator who attacked Musian also had an extremely mysterious formation under his feet, which stopped the cultivator's attack. Sister Mengru, don't kill them, they must be alive, Musian reminded. Wei Mengru pinched her fingers, and there were 5 formations under her feet, covering Gan Chen and the other 2. In the formation, the gorgeous golden light quietly lit up and hit the 2 of them. Gan Chen spat out a mouthful of blood and stumbled back a few steps. The other cultivator was also in pain, fell heavily to the ground, and almost fainted. Wei Mengru returned to Musian's side silently, and then disappeared in the next moment. The cultivators who had just watched the show were stunned for a moment at almost the same time, looking at the yellow-skirted maid who disappeared from their sight in doubt. In less than 3 rounds of fighting, 2 cultivators in the refining spirit realm were suppressed by her alone. Moreover, this beauty had been following Musian just now, but they didn't even notice it. If she had made a move secretly. For a moment, everyone present had a cold sweat on their backs, and at the same time secretly thanked themselves for not making a move. Musian also had some feelings. He had seen Sister Mengru, who was a little shy at times, too much, and only at this time could he realize that Wei Mengru was not just good looking. Her strength was no less than her appearance. Also, the name Gan Chen, could it be that this person is the young master of Ganyuan Pavilion? Musian's eyes inadvertently glanced at the young man who was holding his chest and staring at him hatefully. Then, he unfolded the 8 desolate dream map and directly took the 2 people into it. Of course, they were separated from Lin Qiu who had just been injured. Everything in the 8 desolate dream map was led by Musian, and it was not difficult to create a few more small worlds. After doing all this, Musian looked up at the few people and smiled. It's just right, there are 2 people missing all of a sudden, I wonder if we can join now. Almost all of them looked at each other, and then nodded silently, very tacitly. It's not that they are timid, but the woman next to Musian is really a bit too weird. Wei Mengru's realm has surpassed her peers by far. Even 2 cultivators in the refining spirit realm were suppressed by her. Under such circumstances, it is naturally impossible to oppose Musian's joining. Musian didn't even look at Yeyu, but just raised his head and looked at the ancient bronze door in front of him. He was about to ask about the door. At this moment, he suddenly heard a boom and the ancient door that was originally closed slowly opened. Everyone's eyes were full of surprise, and they looked at each other. Why did the bronze door that was just closed open by itself at this moment? Although they thought about it, they still looked at the bronze door with some expectation in their eyes. After all, they went through so many hardships just for the treasure in the Sword Palace. And at this moment, the treasure may be right in front of them, which is naturally exciting. However, when they looked at it, they only saw an ancient hall behind the door, and at the end of the hall, there was a woman frozen in ice. She had a very beautiful face, wearing a dress embroidered with dark patterns, delicate face, thick eyelashes in front of her slightly closed eyes, thin and moist pink lips, and a mysterious temperament. At this time, she hugged her knees with her hands and curled up in an ice sculpture. Do you look at her, does she look like the Sword Palace master in the mural just now? Suddenly someone whispered, recognizing the identity of this woman. Musion's eyes moved slightly when he heard this, and he couldn't help but look at her a few more times, and then glanced at her chest again. D+, close to E, there is no mistake, this is the Sword Palace Master. After she died, she sealed her body in the formation and then froze it herself. Musion just had this thought in his mind, but suddenly heard Waymengru whispered, "Something is wrong, the ice on her body is melting." The woman's body was slowly steaming after melting, and then the ice began to melt slowly. Is this woman still alive? When this thought flashed through everyone's mind, almost at that moment, the woman who was originally frozen in ice slowly opened her beautiful eyes. So, they were the protagonists all along. Author, CCC. Chapter 246. At this moment, there was silence in the huge hall. Everyone swallowed subconsciously and looked at the beauty who slowly opened her eyes with some surprise. As the ice cubes on her body melted, ice mist rose slowly, and the little ice crystals made the already white skin look even more beautiful. Lord of the Sword Palace. This is a woman whose life is full of legends. From being the daughter of the director of a small martial arts school, relying on an ordinary whiteboard sword, all the way to the end, she finally resonated with the avenue, understood the true meaning of swordsmanship, and founded the Sword Palace. The Peerless Empress. The heartbeats of everyone were speeding up uncontrollably, and they stared at the rebirth of an empress with bewilderment. When the outside world heard that the master of the Sword Palace disappeared mysteriously, no one knew why she disappeared. However, since then, the Sword Palace has slowly declined. After that, the Sword Palace was gradually forgotten by history. People only remembered the supreme grace of the Sword Palace Master. They had heard of the prosperity of the Sword Palace, but they had never seen it. However, at this moment, they saw the palace mistress, and from the looks of it, she might not be dead yet. If so, then she should have sealed herself in the Sword Palace. However, a sword emperor who has existed since ancient times has no problem living for several lives even if she does not seal herself. Why would she go out of her way to seal herself? This question echoed in everyone's mind, even Musion was filled with surprise at this moment. Because Emperor Qing was in front of him, he actually had more or less similar speculations about the fact that the master of the Sword Palace was still alive. It is too difficult for a strong person in the Hedeo realm to die completely. Unless their last ray of spiritual consciousness disappears, it will be difficult for them to completely disappear between heaven and earth. And looking at it like this, before they arrived, the Sword Palace Master had frozen himself in the formation. But the question is, why did the ice sculpture dissolve on its own after they arrived? Coincide? Or is it that the master of the Sword Palace is looking for his heir, so he wakes up from the seal now? At this moment, everyone didn't even dare to move. They just stared at the beautiful woman at the end of the hall in confusion, fearing that if they moved even a little bit, they would attract the other person's attention and some accidents would happen. But while everyone was wondering, the ice sculpture on the woman's body had completely melted. She wore a dress with layers of complicated dark patterns, and her plump breasts held up the fabric, revealing a hint of white. Even though the hall was slightly dim, it was still difficult to hide the beautiful translucent snow-white skin. Under the hem of the skirt was a pair of small and exquisite climbing shoes. At this time, someone suddenly raised his hand and cupped his fist and said, "Young master of Hidden Sword Pavilion, Uzimo, I have met my senior." The sudden sound was particularly conspicuous in the hall, and the master of the Sword Palace inadvertently cast his eyes on the person who spoke. Her eyes were cold and calm, and after a brief gaze, she whispered softly, "The talent is good." Her voice is full of texture, and like the sound of jade being struck, it has a magical power that makes people feel calm. There was a hint of joy in Uzimo's eyes, and he raised his hand and bowed, "Thank you, Senior. Actually, I didn't intend to offend the Sword Palace this time. It's just that the Sword Palace came by itself this time, so." When he said this, he was secretly glad that he was clever. Speaking at this time, he immediately attracted the attention of the Sword Palace Master. When the people around him saw this, they couldn't help but frown secretly, scolding Uzumo for being clever, and at the same time secretly hating themselves for not taking the opportunity to speak just now to get the attention of the Lord of the Sword Palace. Seeing this, Yayu also frowned slightly and was about to speak. At this time, he suddenly seemed to hear something in the bottom of his heart. He was stunned for a moment, and then remained silent. Musian remained quiet, standing aside and watching. The origin of the old man in Yayu's body is mysterious. If he could get the inheritance of the Sword Palace by opening his mouth and attracting the attention of the Lord of the Sword Palace, the old man should have warned Yayu long ago. But Yayu has never made any movement since just now. Does this mean that things are not that simple? Anyway, let's wait and see. After all, he did want the treasure of the Sword Palace, but that didn't mean he had to take too big a risk. The biggest purpose of coming to Sword Palace this time is Bairuoxi. As long as everything goes well for her, it doesn't matter for him. When Musian thought of this, the master of the Sword Palace had already spoken again. Are you all here for the inheritance of the Sword Palace? Because Uzumo was the first to speak, some people could not sit still at this moment. They immediately clasped their fists and said, "It is said that the master of the Sword Palace is unparalleled. This time, I came to the Sword Palace to take a look at the Sword Palace that my senior founded in the past. Secondly, it would be an honor for this junior to continue to carry forward the Sword Palace's skills. Having said so much, to put it bluntly, I want the skills in the Sword Palace." The master of the Sword Palace stood silently, just raising his fingertips and pointing at the high platform beside her. Only now did everyone realize that on the high platform next to it, there was an ancient bronze sword bound by 4 chains, and the 4 chains happened to come from the 4 directions of the hall, which looked quite shocking. "What you want is there. Whether you can get it or not depends on your fate," the cold and sweet voice of the Sword Palace Master sounded. Ancient bronze sword. Almost at that moment, everyone present had a little more eagerness in their eyes, staring at the bronze ancient sword on the high platform in front of the hall, which was bound by 4 chains from 4 directions. "You know, this bronze ancient sword is the ancestral weapon of the Sword Palace Master. If you can get this sword, the first place in the Ascension Conference will be easy to get." Uzumo's eyes were happy, and he immediately asked, "Can the junior go on stage and try now?" "If you fail, the loser will be punished," the Sword Palace Master said, and there was no expression on his delicate and flawless face. However, Uzumo's eyes were completely attracted by the bronze ancient sword at this time. Hearing this, he did not hesitate at all. He stepped on the ground, stretched out his hand towards the high platform, and grabbed the hilt of the sword. Wei Mengru's eyes moved slightly, and she couldn't help but look at Musian, as if she wanted to say something. This ancient bronze sword is probably the 3rd bronze fragment that Bairuoxi lacks. If it is taken away by someone else here. But seeing Musian's calm eyes, Wei Mengru finally held back what she wanted to say. A rumbling sound suddenly came from the high platform in the distance, and everyone's eyes were attracted involuntarily. In front of the high platform, Uzumo's cauldron was running wildly, and spiritual energy burst out. He grabbed the hilt of the sword bound by the chain with one hand, and then tried his best to break the chain. But it was useless. Uzumo was obviously unwilling. He gritted his teeth and held the hilt tightly, as if he was fighting against something, and let out a beast-like roar. However, the ancient bronze sword remained motionless. Uzumo's body staggered and fell off the high platform. Bang! Along with the sound of the body falling heavily to the ground, the voice of the Sword Palace Master also sounded without emotion. "Is there anyone else who wants to try?" "Wait, I haven't given up yet." At this time, Uzumo immediately raised his head and looked at the Sword Palace Master. Although he was in a mess, his eyes were full of dissatisfaction. You have no causal relationship with the sword, and you can't pull out the Sword Palace Master replied coldly. Yuzumo stared at this stunning beauty, his eyes flickered slightly, and said, "You are not the real Sword Palace Master, right?" As soon as these words came out, everyone below was moved. Is Yuzumo crazy because he can't pull out the bronze sword? How dare he say such questioning words to the Sword Palace Master? You are just a remnant soul, and not the remnant soul of the Sword Palace Master, Yuzumo loudly told the truth. He has a very special physique. From the moment he approached the Sword Palace Master, he realized that this woman was not the real Sword Palace Master. A hint of ruthlessness flashed in Yuzumo's eyes, and he threw a long, sharp needle from his sleeve at the woman in front of him. Is this person crazy? Muzian's eyelids twitched slightly, but there was a look of doubt in his eyes. The breath of the Sword Palace Master in front of him was indeed very erratic, but he, a natural spirit, was still not sure that she was not the Sword Palace Master. How did Yuzumo judge it? And, even if she was not the Sword Palace Master, it would be too abrupt to attack rashly. When Muzian's mind was flashing, on the other side, the Sword Palace Master had slightly sidestepped to avoid the sharp needle. Then, under the eyes of everyone, a faint white light quietly lit up in her plump chest. From the white light, a bronze sword that looked extremely ancient appeared in everyone's field of vision. The appearance of this bronze sword is exactly the same as the bound bronze sword in front of the high platform. Two bronze swords, Muzian's eyes were filled with surprise. How could it be possible? While Muzian was thinking about this, the Sword Palace Master had already swung the bronze sword in her hand forward. She was clearly in front of Yuzumo the previous second, but the next moment, she had already appeared behind everyone. Then, the bronze sword in the Sword Palace Master's hand turned into a light spot and drifted away. Boom! There was a loud bang, and no one even saw the Sword Palace Master's sword, but an amazing sound broke out in front of Yuzumo. Window. Tabula equals window. Tabula. Tabula.push, mode, thumbs feed -01, container, tabula below article feed, placement, below article feed, target. Type, mix. Then, Yuzumo's figure disappeared from everyone's sight. Muzian's scalp was numb. This woman is indeed strange. In the hall, the remaining monks subconsciously took a half step back, and at this moment they all wanted to retreat. The Sword Palace Master turned his head expressionlessly and looked at the people behind him, and slowly said, "Who is the next one?" After this, no one responded. With Yuzumo's previous experience, everyone was undoubtedly much calmer than before. This time, no one was willing to be the first to stand out. The Master of the Sword Palace scanned the crowd and spoke slowly, "If no one responds, it will be regarded as all abstentions and will be punished by heaven." At the end of the sentence, her emotionless eyes became colder, like an emotionless machine. "Let's start with you." Her eyes fell on the monk who had just spoken for the second time. The monk seemed to sense some danger and subconsciously took half a step back. Then, he suddenly pointed in the direction of Muzian and said, "The strongest person among us is right next to him. If there is to be a test, the strongest person should start." Everyone's eyes immediately focused on Muzian. To be precise, it should be the maid in the yellow skirt next to Muzian. The Sword Palace Master's eyes also fell on Waimengru. After a brief gaze, an ancient bronze sword slowly emerged from her chest. Boom! The monk who just spoke didn't even have time to dodge before he heard a scream, and then his figure disappeared into the hall. The Master of the Sword Palace did not even look at the second monk, his eyes fell on Waimengru. "It's your turn." This time, no one was gloating about the misfortune. Everyone was frowning and their minds were working faster. There is no doubt that there is definitely something wrong with the Palace Master of the Sword Palace in front of them. Those who fail to pass her test will be punished, and the price of this punishment, they don't know whether they will be expelled from the Sword Palace or directly bombarded. Clean, in this case, these proud men have already retreated in their hearts. Or are you also giving up the test? The Lord of the Sword Palace asked again. Before Wei Mengru could respond, Musian stared at the ancient bronze sword in mid-air and suddenly said, "Senior, before you accept the test, can we know why you woke up from the seal?" The woman glanced at him indifferently and said calmly, "One of you has a cause and effect with this ancient bronze sword, so you can pull out the bronze sword that was bound in it." Her voice was extremely calm, as if she was telling a fact, but because of the scene that just happened in front of everyone, they all didn't believe what this woman said. However, Musian's eyes were a little more thoughtful. If this woman had not lied, then the person who could pull out the sword should be someone who had something to do with the bronze fragment. Except for Bairuoxi, who may be receiving the inheritance, among the people present, the only ones who have causal connections with the bronze fragments are him and Yayu. If anything, Musian was the only person present who had something to do with the bronze sword. "Let me give it a try," Musian said. Rather than letting Wei Mengru take this risk, it would be safer for him to do it. After all, even if he failed, he still had Lin Ling's words left on him. This suspected remnant soul left by the master of the Sword Palace could not directly kill him with the first blow. The master of the Sword Palace did not stop him, but took half a step back to give Musian space to take the stage. Several monks on the side looked at Musian involuntarily, with somewhat complicated emotions in their eyes. They didn't hope that Musian could pull out the sword, but they also hoped that he could pull out the ancient bronze sword. After all, only then would the test be over. But if Musian really pulled out the ancient bronze sword, wouldn't this ancient bronze sword become Musian's? With such complicated emotions, everyone's eyes were fixed on the young man who flew to the high platform. Wei Mengru clenched her fists hidden in her sleeves subconsciously, her eyes fixed on Musian. If he failed to draw the sword later, she would immediately take action and send Musian out of the hall at all costs. Yayu also stared at the scene and sneered secretly. Idiot. The teacher had just told him that the woman in the main hall was not the real master of the Sword Palace, but another version of herself that she had killed in the past. It's good that Musian pulled out the sword. If he couldn't pull it out, then prepare to die. As if aware of Wei Mengru's worried gaze, Musian turned around and gave her a reassuring smile. Then, his eyes fell on the ancient bronze sword bound by chains in front of him. After a brief clue, Musian's eyes quickly became more dignified. This chain is actually a formation. And this formation came from all directions of the hall, and it happened to bind the ancient bronze sword within it. As long as the seals on the four sides of the hall were not released at the same time, the bronze sword could not be pulled out. It's no wonder that Yuzumo failed just now. But Musian felt that he could pull it out. Because from the moment he approached the high platform, he felt that this ancient bronze sword seemed to be calling him. That should be the weapon spirit in the ancient bronze sword. As for the reason, I'm afraid it's because Musian often nourished Bairuoxi day and night in the past, so the weapon spirit in this bronze sword also had a good impression of Musian. Musian took a shallow breath and exhaled it slowly. Then, one hand grasped the hilt of the ancient bronze sword. Wow! The ancient bronze sword that had been silent suddenly reacted, and its blade began to vibrate slightly, causing a heavy sound of iron chains to be heard from the chains at the four corners of the hall. The master of the Sword Palace's eyes moved slightly, and for the first time there was a hint of surprise in his cold eyes as he stared at the young man in the high platform. At this moment, several eyes were staring at Musian, not wanting him to pull out the bronze sword, but hoping that he could pull it out. Under such a complicated human heart, the cauldron in Musian's body quietly operated, and spiritual energy slowly emanated. He held the hilt tightly, as if he wanted to release the bronze sword that was tightly bound by the chain from the seal, and it was like pulling a sword out of a rusty scabbard. Finally, the motionless hilt seemed to be pulled back a little, and accompanied by an extremely unpleasant sound like fingernails scratching glass. He pulled the sword out a little. A monk in the audience saw the clue and whispered in disbelief. Accompanied by another slightly harsh sound, the bronze sword was pulled out a little from the chain again, revealing a hint of its sharpness. The Sword Palace Master's eyes flickered slightly, and his eyes were fixed on this scene. Musian took a deep breath and exhaled slowly. Then he closed his eyes tightly and concentrated his spiritual energy on his whole body. At this moment, it seemed that there was only this ancient bronze sword in his world, and nothing else. There was no doubt that the bronze sword in front of him was the third bronze fragment, so it reacted to him. He could indeed pull out this sword. He just needed to be fully prepared and work hard. It was not impossible to completely release it. After a short period of preparation, Musian grasped the hilt of the bronze sword, took a deep breath, and the spiritual energy in his body burst out. Clang! Most of the sword body of the bronze sword appeared in everyone's vision. Boom! The whole hall was shaking violently at this moment. Musian did not hesitate at all, and completely freed the bronze sword from the shackles in the chains. The edge of the bronze sword was revealed for the first time, cutting off the chains on all sides. Then, it turned into a broken fragment and flew out, quickly attacking a certain cave, and drilled into the chest of Biruoxi, who was receiving the inheritance of the Sword Palace in the cave. The three bronze fragments were pieced together to form a complete bronze sword pattern, and a faint white light emanated from Biruoxi's chest. From the white light, an ancient bronze sword silently emerged from Biruoxi's lower breasts. Then, Biruoxi, no, it should be said that the real Sword Palace Master slowly opened his eyes at this time and stared at the direction where Musian was. "Are you finally here?" There was a hint of relief in her tone. "You are listening to novels at Bless Up channel. Wish you happiness and luck. Please subscribe to receive new novels. How do you feel about this novel? Please like and leave a comment." So, they were the protagonists all along. Author, CCC. Chapter 247. With the release of the bronze sword, everything in the hall collapsed, and the cave was gone in an instant. When Musian was still trying to figure out what happened, the Sword Palace Master, who seemed to have no emotion standing not far in front of him, seemed to have noticed something and slowly turned his head to look behind him. "It's coming so fast." Boom! The hall collapsed completely and turned into a world of nothingness. Fortunately, everyone was a cultivator in the refining spirit realm, so they immediately controlled their flying swords and flew in the air. Musian almost fell from the air, but fortunately he hugged Waymengru's plump waist in time. He immediately looked down at the bottomless darkness under his feet, and couldn't help but sigh with relief. "It's a close call." Waymengru glanced at him coldly and said, "Can't you also fly with a sword?" "The spiritual energy consumption was too great just now," Musian explained. Although she was deeply skeptical of her young master's words, Waymengru didn't have the time to care about this little thing at this time. Because she could sense that in this completely empty space, a figure was rushing towards this direction. Musian naturally noticed this figure, and he looked up. At the end of the field of vision, a woman wearing a pure white dress appeared. Her skirt was flying, and the dress wrapped around her graceful body. She was still far away the moment before, but the next moment, the woman had already appeared in the field of vision. Her waterfall-like hair was simply tied up with a hairpin, and her beautiful face was cold, her skin was white, and her temperament was noble. However, what really attracted Musian was the volume of breasts that was comparable to Biruoxi's. Just at the first glance, it made people feel as if they were about to be sucked into the mystery of the unfathomable. After the first glance, Musian's first thought was that it was so big and white, and then when he looked at it for the second time, he was suddenly stunned. "Damn, isn't this my wife? But why does she look different in temperament?" The woman in front of him was Biruoxi, but her face and clothes were different from the past. But just by seeing the size of her breasts, Musian almost recognized her identity at the first time. There is no mistake, this woman is Bairuoxi. Looking at this stunning beauty, Musian quickly thought of something again, and subconsciously glanced at the Sword Palace Master standing not far in front of him. He didn't pay attention just now, because the pressure of the Sword Palace Master at that time made people unwilling to look up and look at him easily, but now after careful clues and comparisons, Musian suddenly had another thought in his mind. There are two Sword Palace Masters. At this moment, countless question marks flashed through Musian's mind. Bairuoxi, who had just arrived, looked exactly like the Sword Palace Master who was frozen in this hall at the beginning. Then, he thought again, isn't it double the happiness? The two people in front of him, except for the different clothes, are almost exactly the same in appearance, temperament, and even appearance. If they appeared in front of Musian at different times, he couldn't even recognize who was who. At this moment, not only Musian, but also several other cultivators beside him were full of surprise. There may be two similar people in this world, but it is rare to look exactly the same. What's more, this person is the Sword Palace Master. Your mission is over. Staring at the Sword Palace Master in a dark black dress opposite, Bairuoxi said in a calm tone. If you cut off the way of heaven, not only me, you will also die. The Sword Palace Master stared at Bairuoxi expressionlessly. However, Bairuoxi's plump lips pursed slightly, and then a very beautiful arc was outlined. Who told you that I must need the heavenly Deo to be in harmony with the Deo? Between her snow-white ravines, an ancient bronze sword appeared silently in front of her. Bairuoxi grabbed the hilt of the sword, and the ancient bronze sword almost instantly exuded an aura that made the cultivators present tremble. Musian was also shocked and subconsciously hugged Waymengru's plump waist tightly, feeling the shock from the heart. The aura exuded by this bronze sword at this moment was much stronger than the one Bairuoxi used in Tianqian City in the past. He even had the urge to pay homage to this ancient bronze sword just by looking at it. Looking at the several cultivators in the refining god realm on the side, they were completely unable to resist this pressure. Even if they tried their best to resist, they still knelt on one knee on the sword, supporting the sword with both hands, and did not dare to look up to watch this scene. They didn't even know why there were two Sword Palace Masters now, they just trembled instinctively. For the first time, a trace of surprise flashed in the Sword Palace Master's calm eyes. He looked up and stared at Bairuoxi, and said coldly, "Humanity. How is it possible? You have already merged with me, how can you merge with me again? The rules of heaven and earth don't say that a person in the merging realm can only merge with me once in his life." Bairuoxi, who seemed to be possessed by some kind of existence, smiled faintly and waved the bronze ancient sword in his hand. Buzz. The bronze ancient sword was trembling slightly, and then it made a sharp buzzing sound. Boom. The plain sword of Bairuoxi turned into a golden light, directly covering the Sword Palace Master. The master of the Sword Palace, who was as emotionless as a murderous god just now, never resisted. He just faced the terrifying pressure of spiritual energy, stared at Bairuoxi in disbelief, and whispered, "I see, is that the reason why you died with me in the first place." The world has countless speculations about the death of the Palace Master of Sword Palace. Some people think that she was killed by a mysterious unknown attack. Some people think that she was unable to pass the test of inner demons when she created her own martial arts and finally sat in the Sword Palace. Therefore, there was no movement at all when he mysteriously disappeared. Some people think that she died in the turmoil of heaven and earth, and was punished by the rules of heaven and earth, and then disappeared between heaven and earth. But in fact, the master of the Sword Palace did not die, he just killed his past self that resonated with the Deo of heaven. Before she died, she created a scabbard, to complete her new life. And that scabbard is Bairuoxi. With the slash of Bairuoxi's sword, the body of the Sword Palace Master turned into a wisp of deep black spiritual energy. Then, that wisp of dark spiritual energy quietly penetrated into Bairuoxi, or the real sword palace. In the body of the palace owner. The white palace dress was silently dyed with a layer of dark patterns, making the originally pure and beautiful woman seem to have a more charming and enchanting temperament. And there seems to be a dark line on the ancient bronze sword, which makes the ancient bronze sword seem to have a bit more historical weight. This scene happened so suddenly that no one present could react. After all, why there are two sword palace masters is still puzzling to this day. But soon, in addition to being confused, everyone looked at the sword palace master with a bit of fiery color in their eyes. There is no doubt that this empress is the real master of the sword palace. The people present were all monks with extremely talented swordsmanship, and the sword that the master of the sword palace just returned to his original form could only be accomplished by the master of the sword palace in this world. Coupled with the ancient bronze sword in her hand, these books have already confirmed that this woman is the master of the sword palace, the only sword emperor in the world. She is not dead yet, she is really alive in front of them at this moment. The palace master of the sword palace turned her head slightly and looked at the people not far away. Her eyes swept over several people one by one, then stayed on Musian for a moment, and then glanced at Waymengru inadvertently. "Are you all the newcomers?" She looked around at everyone, her beautiful eyes reflecting the figures of the monks in front of her. A young monk immediately clasped his fists respectfully and said, "The sword palace reappeared in the world a few days ago. The younger generation has always been very longing for the name of sword emperor. This time, with this mentality, I wanted to find out what happened in the sword palace and confirm it. Whether the predecessors will still be around for a long time. It sounds so nice, but in fact, he is here just for the sword palace's skills." The lord of the sword palace naturally knew it, but he didn't mind. A pleasant voice came to everyone's ears, "The sword palace will collapse in a while, and there are also skills left over from my past. As for the ability to whether you get it or not depends on your fate." Several people looked at each other and saw a hint of joy in each other's eyes. This time, not only did I meet the real master of the sword palace, but this great master even planned to personally grant me a fairy fate. Such a fact is naturally gratifying. The lord of the sword palace gently raised his fingertips, and the empty space just now quietly returned to the dim hall. Everyone who was present just now quietly disappeared into the hall, and there was only a voice lingering in their ears, "Go." Musian looked at the people who had disappeared from sight, and wanted to say, "Honey, why don't you give me some immortality, something like that?" However, after considering that the other person was not really Bairuoxi at the moment, he still suppressed his inner complaints and turned to secretly observe the stunning beauty in front of him. It has to be said that compared to Bairuoxi, her temperament is completely opposite to Bairuoxi. If Bairuoxi is more like a pure, weak, and innocent young lady, then the master of the sword palace is more mysterious and noble. And seems to have a somewhat sinister feeling. As if aware of Musian's gaze, the sword palace master's eyes also fell on Musian. There seemed to be a hint of tenderness in those beautiful, cold eyes. The two looked at each other in silence for a while, then Musian had no choice but to speak, "Should I call you Ruoxi, or the master of the sword palace?" "You can call her whatever you like." Bairuoxi's red lips parted slightly, with a glimmer of water in her eyes. "Bairuoxi is the master of the sword palace." After a brief silence, Musian finally asked the question that mattered most to him. "She is the scabbard I will leave behind in this world, and she is also the person who will occupy the dominant position in the future." Bairuoxi looked around casually and smiled casually. "I know you have a lot of things you want to ask, but this is not the place to talk. Let's go somewhere else." She glanced at Waymengru, who remained quiet, and then snapped her fingers. The surrounding environment changed from a dim hall to an open grassland. Bairuoxi sat in front of a stone table carved from white jade, then poured a cup of tea for Musian and pushed it in front of him. Musian raised his eyes and looked at the woman in front of him, who pressed her plump and straight breasts on the table and looked at him seriously. She is indeed different from Ruoxi. Her desire to attack seems to be stronger. Musian calmly took a sip of tea and then said, "What did you mean by the scabbard just now?" Ruoxi is the person I left behind when I was in resonance with humanity. To put it bluntly, she is the scabbard and I am the sword body. Ruoxi's lips curved slightly, and she smiled and said, "As for the reason, it has to do with the way of heaven." The way of heaven. Musian had heard the word the way of heaven more than once, but at this moment he was still full of questions, so he continued to listen patiently to Ruoxi's words. As Ruoxi narrated, Musian finally understood. The master of the Sword Palace was the most popular in the world, and people had various speculations about her death. Many people thought that she was attacked by a mysterious person, or even sat in the Sword Palace. But in fact, the master of the Sword Palace did not die, but was reborn in another way. The state of harmony is to be in harmony with one of the three realms of heaven, earth, and man. At the beginning, the master of the Sword Palace understood the way of heaven, resonated with the way of heaven when he was in the Hedeo realm, and became the Sword Emperor in Kyushu. However, after that, for some unknown reason, the master of the Sword Palace cut off the way of heaven that he had understood, and at the same time, he also cut off himself who resonated with the way of heaven. The master of the Sword Palace who was frozen just now is the remnant soul of the master of the Sword Palace who resonates with the way of heaven, or should be said to be the remnant soul of the will of the way of heaven. I remember it was said in ancient books that there is no distinction between strength and weakness among the three realms of heaven, earth, and man. "Why did you want to kill the heavenly realm?" Musian asked. Ruoxi shook her head and said, "There are some problems with the way of heaven. Those who choose the way of heaven will either follow the way of heaven in the future, or they will have to override it, or they can rejoin the way. The master of the Sword Palace is unparalleled in his magnificence, beheading the way of heaven, and even beheading himself. And in the end, she walked out of another path and joined the path of people." Ruoxi was the answer she handed over. "I hid my spiritual consciousness in 3 bronze fragments, each of which contained only 1/3 of my spiritual consciousness. The remnant soul of the will of heaven just now probably wanted to get rid of one of the spiritual consciousness first, but she didn't expect that the other 2 bronze fragments have already been collected." When Ruoxi said this, her eyes became a little softer and she said, "You are much better than I thought." Musian hesitated for a moment and said, "Where did Ruoxi go after you returned?" Ruoxi tapped the white snow on her chest with her slender fingertips, tilted her head slightly and said with a smile, "Here. Now she can hear the conversation between you and me. Similarly, I can also hear the conversation between you and her in the future." "Does it mean 1 body and 2 souls?" Musian was slightly confused. Then, I felt a little weirder in my heart. Looking at it like this, the positioning of the heroine in the personal interface is really correct. Everyone he knows seems to have a golden finger, even Ruoxi. "Senior, aren't you worried that I didn't get the 3 bronze fragments, or didn't come to the Sword Palace?" Musian suddenly asked. If he hadn't gone to the Sword Palace with Ruoxi, or if he hadn't taken the first bronze fragment before Yayu, then what happened today wouldn't have happened. Could it be that the master of the Sword Palace had already deduced the secret before that and reached this point? "I knew you would come." The master of the Sword Palace showed a beautiful smile and played with the concentric lock that had been poked out of his sleeves at some point. "I made an agreement with someone in the past. At that time, she swore on the Great Road that after I killed the heavenly me, she would make me reappear as a human being." "Someone? When did it happen?" Musian asked. The Lord of the Sword Palace pondered for a moment and said, 10,000 years ago. 1,000 years? Musian looked at the white and black dress of the palace master of the Sword Palace and the graceful figure that clung to the fabric. He smiled on the surface but said nothing in his heart. This palace master of the sword palace wasn't he deceived by someone? 10,000 years of vicissitudes of life, who knows what will happen 10,000 years from now? After all, if he hadn't happened to get the bronze fragment from Regina this time, it would be impossible to awaken the spiritual consciousness of the sword palace master now, let alone kill the last remnant soul of heaven and become the sword palace master. The gesture of humanity. What are you thinking about? The master of the sword palace looked at Musian tenderly with a smile in his eyes. She has Bairuoxi's memory, and naturally has a lot of affection for the young man in front of her. What's more, thanks to him pulling out the sword and untying the third bronze fragment this time, her spiritual consciousness can be completely pieced together. I was just wondering who made the agreement with you. If I hadn't arrived at the sword palace by chance this time, I don't know how long it would have taken for that person to complete the agreement, Musian said tactfully. What are you talking about? The Lord of the Sword Palace smiled sweetly. Hasn't she already fulfilled her agreement with me? Right now. But didn't it happen that I came to Sword Palace? When Musian just thought of this, he suddenly seemed to remember something and was stunned for a moment. His smile faded away bit by bit until it finally solidified. He suddenly thought of something just now. The second bronze fragment was obtained from Regina. Regina, on the other hand, came all the way from the southern wasteland to Dongzhou. What is her purpose? Ascension Conference. Then here comes the problem. Why did Nanhuang let Regina participate in the Immortal Ascension Conference? Someone in the southern wilds mentioned the bet, and later Shang Yanfei accepted the bet. Because Regina is the most gifted genius in the southern wilds, the southern wilds must get the imperial level medicinal materials at the Ascension Conference, and also want to get back at the game, so they will definitely send Regina. After that, when they arrived at the Lianji sect, Regina's soul reading physique would naturally detect the Tiansheng furnace, and would also know that there is a reincarnation aura in the Tiansheng furnace that can strengthen the physique. But this involves a problem. In the case of the same realm, whether the Tiansheng furnace will be exposed depends on whether Musian himself wants to deliberately leak it. The current environment is obviously very good, with a warm breeze blowing, but Musian shivered slowly. What's wrong? Bairuoxi asked with a slight tilt of his head, playing with the heart-to-heart lock in his hand. Musian stared at Bairuoxi with a dull look, and asked in a difficult tone. The person who made a promise with you 10,000 years ago, is the sect master Shang Yanfei. So, they were the protagonists all along. Author, CCC. Chapter 248. This is a very ridiculous guess, but Musian now has to believe its authenticity. Because, judging from various performances in the past and present, some of my immortal relationships do have the shadow of the elder sister behind them. Even this time's fairy fate is the same. But what exactly does the sect leader's sister want to do? You can't have a crush on me, Musian cursed in his heart. On the other side, after hearing Musian's inquiry, the master of the sword palace narrowed her beautiful eyes, and then said with a slight smile, I have an agreement with the other party, and I cannot give any hint of revealing her identity. That being said, it should be the sect master who is right. Musian looked at the beautiful smile of the master of the sword palace and already had such a guess in his heart. But since the other party said so, he naturally stopped asking further questions and instead observed the dress of the beauty in front of him. Although she is similar to Bairuoxi, her temperament is completely different from Bairuoxi. She wears a plum-colored jacket over her black and white skirt, a skirt that reaches slightly to her knees, and her carefully combed bun is held up by a hosta. From now on, the hosta is dotted with a blood-red spirit stone. A necklace inlaid with emerald-colored spiritual stones hangs from the jade neck. If we were to talk about the similarities between the Sword Palace Master and Bairuoxi, it would probably be the same elegant posture, elegant temperament, and plump and charming figure. However, Bairuoxi would not look at people with such calm and indifferent eyes, because after all, she was a weak young lady. Those 3 bronze fragments seemed to disappear after they were gathered together. Muzian suddenly noticed this small detail. No wonder she always felt something was wrong when she looked at the plump breasts of the Sword Palace Master. The bronze fragment that should have been hanging on her chest before has now disappeared. Like Ruoxi, it is now hidden in the body, the Master of the Sword Palace replied. I know that your breasts are very large and can hide a lot of things, but it would be too exaggerated to store Ruoxi and the ancient bronze sword directly in your body, Muzian asked again. Why was I able to pull out that sword just now? What is the so-called cause and effect? You got the first bronze fragment, and after that, you became a Taoist companion with the other me who is the scabbard. This has already determined that you will find the 3rd bronze fragment in the future. This is cause and effect, the Lord of the Sword Palace said. If you and her were not Taoist lovers, you wouldn't be able to pull out the sword today. If that's the case, before my spiritual consciousness returns today, you may have been killed by the remnant soul of Tiandao in advance. In other words, did my LSP actually save my life? Muzian couldn't help but secretly feel happy. If he hadn't pursued by Ruoxi in Tianqian City, and if he hadn't entered the Sword Palace this time, he might have been killed by the remnant soul of the Heavenly Dao before the real Master of the Sword Palace woke up. This was the case with the few monks who died first. That remnant soul of Heavenly Dao, is it you too? Muzian asked. That remnant soul is me when I resonated with the way of heaven in the past, and it has just been completely integrated with me, the Master of the Sword Palace replied. In the future, when Ruoxi cultivates to the realm of enlightenment and understands the humanity, I will be able to return to the realm of enlightenment. In other words, the Master of the Sword Palace killed his past self because of some problem with the way of heaven, and prepared to join the way with human beings again. And Ruoxi, was this preparation for humanity? At this moment, Muzian suddenly realized. Are Ruoxi and you the same person? Muzian asked a question that concerned him more. She and I have 2 different personalities. The scabbard is the dominant spiritual consciousness, and I am her second spiritual consciousness. Are there any other questions? The Sword Palace Master's voice was full of tenderness, as if it was the same as Ruoxi's in the past, with a hint of affection in his eyes, which made Muzian feel strange. Logically speaking, this was the first time he had communicated with the Palace Master of Sword Palace, but the other party's attitude at the moment made him a little uncomfortable. Do you really have all of Ruoxi's memories? Muzian asked tentatively. What I have is her life experience and what happened with you, the Lord of Sword Palace said. At this point, Muzian's inner doubts had been completely answered, so he fell silent and stopped asking any more questions. At this moment, the Master of the Sword Palace changed his voice and said softly, if you have no questions, I also have something to ask you. For some reason, seeing the gentle smile on the face of this elegant and refined beauty, Muzian had a vague feeling of bad premonition. The Master of the Sword Palace narrowed her beautiful eyes. I have most of her memories, so I also know some of the things that happen around you. After this time, I may need to sleep in the scabbard for a while longer, waiting for her to understand in the future. A wisp of rhyme will wake you up. So before that, I have some personal issues and I want to have a good chat with you. Palace Master, please speak. Juniors are listening. Muzian straightened his posture, with a gentle and obedient look on his face. I don't know what happened between you and the women around you, and I have no interest in knowing. The Lord of the Sword Palace smiled brightly and said softly, however, in the future, when you are with me, don't get close to other women. If you wake up and find that there are many Taoist companions around you, it will make me a little embarrassed. Obviously, the Sword Palace Master had no objection to Ruoxi's choice of Taoist partner. After all, they were the same person. However, compared to Ruoxi, as the only Sword Emperor in Zhuzhou, the Sword Palace Master was obviously more powerful and seemed to have a strong possessiveness. The Sword Palace Master looks like a great beauty, but why does she seem a bit Yandere? Muzian coughed, then raised his hand and gently grasped the Sword Palace Master's hand, looking at her tenderly, and said, "Ruoxi." Musian shook his head gently, "No, no matter whether you are Ruoxi or the Palace Master, my feelings for you are sincere." He let the heart lock silently wrap around his wrist, and looked at the Sword Palace Master's exquisite and beautiful face affectionately, saying, "I know what to do." The Sword Palace Master had a faint smile in his eyes and said, "There is a first-grade skill I created in the Sword Palace. After this, I need to retreat for a few days. You can temporarily comprehend the skill in the Sword Palace. I will transfer the permission of the Sword Palace to you. Does it mean that I can own those spiritual minds outside and even everything in the Sword Palace? Is this rich lady planning to support me?" Musian's heart moved slightly, but he still looked reserved. "Wouldn't this be bad? Besides, there are other cultivators in the Sword Palace who are looking for immortal fate. You decide how to use it, and you don't need to ask for my opinion," the Sword Palace Master said. Musian hesitated for a moment, then nodded slightly. "Okay, since the Palace Master said so, I'd better obey." After the two chatted for a few more sentences, Musian suddenly asked, "Can Ruoxi hear our conversation now?" The Sword Palace Master is obviously just a spiritual consciousness, but when she is in charge, the face she presents is her face instead of by Ruoxi. Even now, Musian is still a little incredible. The Sword Palace Master nodded coldly. "Just now I seem to have told you that she is in here now." She placed her slender hand between the snow-white ravines, and said in a pleasant voice, "She can also hear the conversation between you and me." Sure enough, big breasts are good. Not only can they be used as scabbards, but they can also hide spiritual consciousness. Musian couldn't help but sigh in his heart. After the conversation between the two ended, the Sword Palace Master raised her fingertips and untied the heart lock on Musian's wrist. Under her beautiful face, the corners of her lips outlined a charming arc, and she said softly, "Don't forget the agreement between you and me. After returning, go and explain it clearly to your other confidants. I hope you won't let me down when we meet next time." Musian said softly, "I know my limits. Wait until the next meeting. That will have to wait until Ruoxi comprehends a ray of Tao rhyme. And this will take a very long time. During that period, Ye Lingxian and others should have been able to break through the return to the void and reach the enlightenment or even the integration of the Tao. By then, the situation will be completely stabilized. The current Sword Palace Master is undoubtedly the most dangerous shark in the fish pond. If he had just rejected the Sword Palace Master, the other party might not sleep peacefully, and might even go to find Ye Lingxian and others, which would cause unnecessary trouble. What he needs to do now is to appease this beauty first, and then raise the fish in the fish pond with peace of mind. When their strengths are similar, there is no need to worry about one side absolutely crushing them. It's just a pity that such a beautiful beauty will not be seen in a short time. Musian can't help but feel a little regretful. "What are you thinking about?" The Sword Palace Master seemed to have noticed Musian's psychological changes and looked sideways. "It's inevitable that I feel a little lonely when I think that I won't be able to see the Palace Master for a while in the future." Musian shook his head and sighed, revealing his true feelings this time. The Sword Palace Master's charming peach blossom eyes turned, and she pursed her red lips slightly, without saying anything. After sending Musian back to the hall at the beginning, she left on her own and disappeared in the hall. But before leaving, she looked at Musian meaningfully again. Musian closed his eyes slightly, and could feel that everything in the Sword Palace seemed to be completely incorporated into his mind at this moment. He could even feel the descendants of the ancient families who were adventuring around the Sword Palace at this moment, looking for immortal fate. The Sword Palace Master was really generous, although the Spirit Stones had lost their original spiritual energy with the passage of time. Those skills, spirit mines, and even the two newly formed Imperial-level medicinal herbs were still there. If these natural treasures were placed in the outside world, they would have to fight for them. As a result, she gave these things to him. It was indeed the right choice to eat soft rice, Musian exclaimed in his heart again. But he didn't expect that the 2 imperial-level medicinal herbs were actually placed in the courtyard from the beginning, and among those blooming flowers. This is the immortal fate. If he hadn't obtained the permission of the Sword Palace, he would never have thought that the imperial-level medicinal herbs would be placed in front of everyone in his life, and so many cultivators who had just come to the Sword Palace didn't notice it. Musian was full of emotion. Are you really going to cut off your relationship with Miss Lingxian and the others? At this moment, Wei Mengru's cold and pleasant voice suddenly came from behind. Musian returned to reality from his previous thoughts, and when he turned his head, he happened to meet Wei Mengru's cold eyes. He raised the corner of his mouth slightly and said with a smile, if she had just rejected the palace master and then went to find Sister Lingxian and the others in person, it would cause unnecessary trouble. But in the future, as long as Sister Lingxian and the others are similar in strength to the palace master, we no longer have to worry about one side being absolutely crushed. In order to protect the fry in his fish pond, Musian danced on the tip of the knife with good intentions. Wei Mengru pondered what Musian just said, and said quietly, aren't you worried about yourself? If Miss Lingxian and the others know that you agreed to the conditions of the Sword Palace Master, and even have a complicated relationship with her. Although he didn't say anything further, Musian already knew what Wei Mengru wanted to say. Sure enough, Sister Mengru still cares about me. Musian shook his head and smiled. The relationship between them and I has almost been cultivated, so naturally there is no need to worry about the worst ending. This is the world of cultivating immortals. As long as you choose I want it all instead of being indecisive, cutting things off and making things messy, plus some proper operations, there will be no problems under normal circumstances. Wei Mengru's red lips parted slightly. She wanted to say that the question is, aren't you afraid that one day you will be locked up in a dark room by a black girl? But then I thought, what does this have to do with me? Therefore, Wei Mengru quickly remained silent and just said in a very soft and elegant voice, as long as you are happy. Then, she changed the topic lightly, where are we going now? Or should we stay here and wait for Miss Bai? Musian pondered for a moment and then said with a smile, Ruoxi's side shouldn't be able to end the retreat within 2 or 3 days. Let's take a walk around the Sword Palace first. He was quite interested in the 2 emperor-level medicinal plants that had not been in full bloom for a long time in the Sword Palace. Moreover, he also cared a little about the first-grade skills mentioned by the master of the Sword Palace. Don't Sister Mengru also want to try again to see if those spiritual mines can produce anything good? Musian continued. Previously, each person could only cut one spiritual mine because of certain formations in the Sword Palace, but now that he had the permission from the Sword Palace, there was naturally no such restriction. Wei Mengru's eyes moved slightly, and she was really moved. But the maid in the yellow skirt still maintained a reserved and cold attitude. Others seemed to be still looking for immortality in the Sword Palace. Is that okay? They are looking for their immortal connection, and we are taking our things. Isn't this non-interference? Mu Ji settled down for a moment and continued to smile. However, the thing found in the Sword Palace is immortal fate. Since it is a fairy fate, it will be a little rarer. Only 1 or 2 people can even find it. Is it natural? So, they were the protagonists all along. Author, CCC. Chapter 249. You plan to take most of the things away. It should be said that she is worthy of being Musian's intimate little maid. Almost immediately after hearing his words, Wei Mengru knew his plan. Sister Mengru, have you ever thought about why you are interested in the lottery? I mean, do you know why you care about those spiritual mines outside and want to cut them open to see what's inside? Musian deliberately whetted her appetite. This is something Musian learned from Yao Meng. Sometimes the fairy likes to whet people's appetite like this when she is in bed, and sometimes it makes Musian unable to sleep at night. Now he has learned a little bit of Yao Meng's method. which is now used to whet Wei Mengru's appetite, and can even be used to whet other descendants of ancient families in the Sword Palace. Wei Mengru looked at him with a squint, looking like she didn't want to say anything. In fact, hidden deep in her eyes was genuine curiosity and confusion. Because you have confidence in your luck, you never know what will be cut out of the spiritual mine in the next second. The sudden realization and the unsatisfied feeling when the answer is revealed will make you want to try again. What does this have to do with what you are going to do? Wei Mengru asked. It has something to do with it, of course it has something to do with it. Musian said seriously, if I take away everything in the Sword Palace, it will seem that I am too greedy. My wife, the palace master, may be a little dissatisfied when she knows. So we should not hinder them from finding the immortal fate. Wei Mengru raised her eyebrows slightly, and at the first glance, she felt that her young master seemed to be planning something bad. So you plan to? Sister Mengru, do you know what is the most important thing for a cultivator to upgrade his grade? Musian asked a seemingly unrelated question. Wei Mengru pondered for a moment and said, talent and luck. But what does this have to do with their search for the immortal fate? Wei Mengru continued. Those who can enter the Sword Palace are all people with extremely high sword talents, but if you want to obtain superior skills, elixirs and other immortal opportunities in the Sword Palace, you need not talent, but luck. Musian raised his hand and quietly unfolded the 8 desolate dream map. The 8 desolate dream map unfolded silently like a scroll, and a faint light shone. He turned his head slightly to look at Wei Mengru and smiled. In fact, it's not only Sister Mengru who likes gambling on stones, I like it too, or rather, everyone likes it. You want to enter the 8 desolate dream map? Wei Mengru asked. Musian nodded slightly. Wait for me here, I'll go in and see how Miss Lin is doing, and I'll be back soon. In the 8 desolate dream map, Lin Qiu lay on the bed and slowly opened her eyes. She was wearing a pink and white skirt, a waist belt outlined her slender waist, and a trace of fatigue in her beautiful eyes. She had just refined the Huiwen pill, and her originally exhausted spiritual energy was slowly recovering under the Huiwen pill, but her consciousness was very heavy. After entering the 8 desolate dream map, she fell asleep in the room created by the owner of the 8 desolate dream map. To be fair, if she were dressed in plain clothes and light makeup, although it would be very attractive for a little beauty like Lin Qiu, it would still lack her own characteristics. And this pink and white dress, coupled with the necklace hanging on her chest, showed her delicate collarbone and white jade neck, adding a bit of elegance to her ladylike posture. The white bra was faintly visible under the curtain. Under this gentle and lovely appearance, the moisture in her eyes also added to her weakness, making her enough to be among the most beautiful. As if she remembered something important, Lin Qiu subconsciously touched her clothes, and looked down again. After confirming that there was no sign of disorder, she slowly breathed a sigh of relief in her heart. It seems that your spiritual energy has recovered most of it. The curtain was suddenly gently lifted by someone, and a gentle voice of a young man came from the side, which made Lin Qiu subconsciously look up. A young man wearing a black and gold robe and with sword-like eyebrows and star-like eyes was standing beside the bed, with a sunny smile on his face. Musian looked Lin Qiu up and down again, and then showed a faint smile. It seems that there should be no problem. Lin Qiu only reacted at this time, propped up her body and sat on the bed, and said softly, "Thank you for your help this time. If it weren't for you, I'm afraid I would have." If it weren't for Musian this time, Lin Qiu's ancestral artifact fragments would probably have been taken away by Gan Chen. After that, even if Lin Qiu encountered an accident in the Sword Palace, there would be no evidence. No one would know who had done the harm to her, and they would only think that she had encountered an accident in the Sword Palace. When thinking of this, Lin Qiu looked at the young man in front of her with gratitude and some special feelings hidden in her eyes. Even though Lin Qiu's talent is among the best in Dongzhou, after all, She is just a young girl who has not experienced much of the world and fantasizes about some beautiful pink romances, and Musian's appearance alone can definitely attract the love of little girls and even queens, plus the two met in such a special situation. This naturally made Lin Qiu have a better impression of Musian. What I hate most in my life is sinister villains. Miss Lin, you don't have to be so polite. Musian didn't seem to notice some special emotions in the girl's eyes, and just smiled gently. Look at the other two people who attacked you, are they the two of them? He raised his hand and snapped his fingers. In the room, an image appeared silently in his field of vision. In the image, two handsome-looking young men were desperately trying to escape with their swords in the Eight Desolations dream picture. Behind them, there was a rather terrifying-looking creature chasing the two. If you take a closer look, you will find that the creature is the evil god of the southern wilderness. Everything in the Eight Desolations dream picture is controlled by Musian, and both of them were seriously injured. It is naturally difficult to escape from the Eight Desolations dream picture at this time. Lin Qiu glanced up subconsciously, his eyes slowly opened wide. He turned to look at Musian and said, "Did you catch them?" Her eyes were full of disbelief. A third-level god-refining monk actually killed two god-refining monks who were higher than him at the same time. Then, she quickly looked at Musian blankly. "Why would you help me like this?" Logically speaking, it is not easy for the other party to secretly send her back to Swanyan Palace. After all, the other party is an ancient force like Qianyuan Pavilion in Dongzhou. If she is offended, ordinary monks may not be able to take her away. In the end, the other party not only saved her, but even killed the young master of Qianyuan Pavilion, Qian Chen, and Qian Chen's cousin. Wasn't he afraid of offending Qianyuan Pavilion? Musian raised his hand and gently brushed away Lin Qiu's loose hair, and smiled. "Do you need any more reasons to save people? What's more, she is such a lovely girl like Miss Lin." Lin Qiu's pretty face turned red and she retracted her gaze as if she was electrocuted. The little beauty is indeed easier to capture than the big shark. Musian sighed secretly and said warmly, "After this, I will hand them over to Swanyan Palace and let your father handle it on his own." He paused and continued, "But before that, I plan to give you a gift of immortality." Xian Yuan. Lin Qiu slowly raised his head and looked at the sunny smile on the handsome young man's face. He opened his mouth slightly and whispered something. After sending Lin Qiu away, Musian looked at Wei Mengru, who was waiting for him silently in the main hall, and said with a smile, "Let's go, Sister Mengru, I will take you to cut off all the spiritual minds." Wei Mengru raised her eyebrows slightly and said, "Aren't you going to leave some for others?" Last time in the Spirit Dragon's cave, Musian managed to leave 2 pieces of luck for people, but this time he didn't even intend to leave one, which surprised the maid. Musian shook his head. "I don't like to make things so desperate. The immortal fate they should find should still be found." Under Wei Mengru's confused gaze, Musian looked back at the maid in the yellow skirt. "It's just that we need to package it more carefully. After all, only what you work hard for can make you happy." Meanwhile, on the other side, a group of talented monks were walking in the Sword Palace at this time. Ever since the master of the Sword Palace asked everyone to find their own immortal fate, they had scattered around the Sword Palace. However, even after so long, they had never been there. Any skills or even pills are found in the Sword Palace. Nearly an hour later, the monks who had been scattered all over the place met unknowingly and were walking together on a remote path in the forest. "There are too many caves in this place. If we follow the usual method, I'm afraid we won't gain anything before the Sword Palace disappears." After a moment of silence, a monk finally couldn't help but speak. "There must be some immortal destiny in the Sword Palace, but whether we can get it or not depends on my luck." Another monk next to him frowned, but his face didn't look good either. Entering the Sword Palace this time originally made them very happy, because it was rumored that there was a first-grade skill created by the Sword Emperor hidden in the Sword Palace. Now that the Sword Emperor has been reborn, it is unrealistic to get the bronze sword in her hand, but, that first grade technique is probably still hidden in the sword palace. If you can get it, it will be a worthwhile trip. Just now. Not to mention the first grade skills, even ordinary pills and medicinal materials were not found. Muzian is gone too, someone suddenly said, and he realized that the Liangyi sect disciple who had been following everyone just now had disappeared. I remember that the daughter of the master of Swanyan Palace also entered the sword palace, but I haven't seen her yet. Someone suddenly said. If she were here, she might be able to detect some magical connections. Lin Qiu had undergone a luck test before, and her luck was an extremely glamorous red color, which also meant that her luck was naturally stronger than that of most monks. If she is here, it is very likely that you can get some immortal fate. And at that time, they could also get something later. Just at this time, a graceful figure was flying towards him with a sword not far away. Everyone present was at a high level. Naturally, they noticed the person behind them and couldn't help but look back. Miss Lin, where have you been before? I didn't see you. A monk who was familiar with Lin Qiu's eyes lit up and he immediately said hello. Lin Qiu was wearing a fluttering skirt and had a compassionate temperament. In the wind, the skirt clung to her graceful body. She lightly jumped down from the flying sword with a reserved smile on her face. I was accidentally trapped in a cave in the sword palace. Fortunately, I managed to escape in the end. I see. No one had doubts, and even if some people still had some doubts, they never asked. After all, what is more important right now is the immortal fate of Sword Palace. A few people were walking along a bottomless path in the mountain forest. Under the lush green branches and leaves, they could still faintly hear the chirping of insects and birds. It was completely different from the winter outside. This place was like a completely different world. After nearly half an hour, they walked out of the trail and saw a waterfall. In front of the waterfall, there were spiritual minerals of different colors everywhere. Are there so many spiritual mines here? Everyone just glanced at each other and couldn't hold it any longer. They each found a piece of spiritual mineral of different shapes and planned to cut it open. However, as soon as the palm touched the spiritual mine, it was separated by an invisible formation, making it difficult to reach it. The spiritual mines here are also restricted by the formation and cannot be touched. Yeah, you frowned slightly, feeling a little dissatisfied. You can't touch this or that. How can there be any immortality in this sword palace? At the same time, several young geniuses on the side also hit a wall and could not reach the spiritual mine with their hands. Just as everyone was secretly frowning, Lin Qiu behind him let out a cry of surprise. Everyone turned around to look, and saw that the spiritual mine that Lin Qiu had just touched had been cut open, and inside the spiritual mine. Yes, it is a thin booklet. There was a charming red halo on the booklet, with 3 big characters printed on it, Sword of the Three Realms. Second grade technique. Everyone couldn't sit still all of a sudden, their eyes were blazing, staring at the second grade skill in Lin Qiu's hand. Miss Lin, why can't we touch the spiritual mine? But you can, even you couldn't sit still and stared at Lin Qiu's charming profile. Lin Qiu smiled softly and did not hide anything. Injecting spiritual energy into the spiritual minerals will unlock the formation. Each spiritual mineral needs to be injected with spiritual energy. I tried it before, but I couldn't break this formation. Do you have any other tips? I hope Miss Lin can give me some advice, someone immediately asked humbly. Generally speaking, if you want to break the formation, you need to find the eye of the formation, and then use spiritual energy to dismantle the formation. However, the formations in the Sword Palace are naturally not something that monks in the God-refining realm can unravel. At this moment, none of them were able to unlock the formation on the spiritual mine, but Lin Qiu did it. This naturally made people care. If Lin Qiu can unlock the formation of one spiritual mine, doesn't it mean that she can unlock all the formations of hundreds of spiritual mines here? However, with so many people present, if she wanted to eat so much food by herself, I'm afraid she wouldn't have the ability. Lin Qiu obviously knew this, so he explained, the spiritual energy in our bodies cannot unlock the formation eyes in the formation, but I just thought of another method. If spiritual energy doesn't work, what about the spiritual stones? Spiritual stone. I have heard that in some special blessing caves, the monk's own aura cannot be used to unlock the formation. However, the aura in the spiritual stone is naturally formed by heaven and earth, so it is special and can unlock the formation. A monk, he couldn't help but say, his eyes lit up slightly. This method was something they never thought of at first. Everyone looked at each other, then immediately took out a valuable spiritual stone and poured it into the formation eye. Yeah, you also took out a spirit stone worth 5,000, and as the spirit stone was poured into the formation eye, he was immediately surprised to find that the formation seemed to be much weaker than at the beginning. This method is indeed feasible, the monk's excited voice also came from beside him. If it was ordinary stone gambling that existed in the outside world, they would naturally not care. But you must know that Lin Qiu just cut out the second-grade skills in the spiritual mines, and maybe even the first-grade skills are also hidden in these spiritual mines. As if they were afraid that the first-level skills would be cut out by others first, several descendants of the ancient family present immediately took out the spirit stones. After finding the formation eye on the spirit mine, they poured the spirit stones into it. Judging from their estimates, about 50,000 spirit stones can unlock the formation of a spirit mine. This price is very expensive. Even if they are the descendants of the ancient family, they cannot get more than 1 million spirit stones. But if it's for the first level skills, no matter how high the price is, it's worth it. Lin Qiu silently took out the second blood drop stone, which was only the size of a fingernail, and poured it into the formation eye of a spiritual mine. Compared to other monks who suffered from physical pain, she actually felt nothing. It's not that she doesn't care about spirit stones, but Musian promised her something just now. After that, Miss Lin's spirit stones will be returned in full, so you don't have to worry about the spirit stones. You can use as many spirit stones as you have. I will also lend you the 1 million spirit stones here. Thinking of what Musian said to him at that time, and his warm smile, Lin Qiu still feels weird in his heart. She didn't know what that person wanted to do, but he was her savior. Since he saved her, there was no reason to harm her. When thinking of this, Lin Qiu squatted in front of one of the spiritual mines with his hands and knees, and then silently took out 50,000 worth of spiritual stones again and injected them into the formation eye. In front of a dim hall, Musian silently counted the spirit stones that kept appearing in front of him, and then glanced at Wei Mengru standing beside him, and said, "Sister Mengru, come and help count how many spirit stones you can earn this time. I'm not very good at counting." "What did you say to that girl just now?" Wei Mengru looked at the formation in front of Musian with a strange look in her eyes, and couldn't help asking. From the beginning, a large number of various special spirit stones kept appearing in the formation in front of Musian, and each one was conservatively estimated to be worth 50,000 spirit stones. Although it was unclear what happened, it was clear that his young master must have secretly done something with the formation of the Sword Palace. After all, the permission of the Sword Palace has been shared with Musian, and he also has the control of the formation of the Sword Palace. It's just to give her a chance to become an immortal. Of course, she is also needed to play the role of cracking the secret of the Sword Palace's spiritual mine. Musian looked at the special spiritual stones that kept pouring out of the formation, turned his head to look at the graceful figure of the yellow-skirted maid, and smiled. "I just said it, Sister Mengro. Everyone loves gambling on stones the most." You are listening to Novels at Bless Up channel. Wish you happiness and luck. Please subscribe to receive new novels. How do you feel about this novel? Please like and leave a comment. So, they were the protagonists all along. Author, CCC. Chapter 250. Deep in the Sword Palace. Bairuoxi closed her eyes slightly and sat in front of the soft couch. The skirt of her palace skirt could not hide her proud and plump chest, which was slightly covered by the curtain. If you look at it from the perspective of an outsider, you will only think that she is simply meditating and practicing, but in fact, Bairuoxi is accepting the 108 sharp blades of light passed down by the master of the sword palace. Almost every half an hour, a golden lightsaber surrounding the sword palace will turn into golden aura and enter Bairuoxi's chest. This is the inheritance of the sword palace. After the 108 lightsabers were completely transformed into aura and completely entered Bairuoxi's chest, the inheritance of the sword palace was completely completed. You seem to be a little uneasy. Are you thinking about him? At this time, a voice suddenly came from the bottom of Bairuoxi's heart. Bairuoxi slowly opened her eyes, and a woman with a similar figure to her appeared in front of her, but her temperament was more like a mature lady. The Sword Palace Master, or in other words, Bairuoxi's other spiritual consciousness. Bairuoxi nodded slightly and said softly, "Wouldn't this be a bit too much for Mu Lang? Not only me, but also Sister Lingxian and Sister Qian like him very much. If he were to ask for it?" Bairuoxi naturally heard what the Sword Palace Master and Muzian said before. Although she really wanted to have Muzian alone, but now if she asked him to ask for it with other people, she still couldn't bear it. And it would also bring him a lot of trouble. The Sword Palace Master looked at Bairuoxi with a smile in his eyes, and then shook his head slowly, saying, "You don't have to care about this matter. I will handle it properly after this, so that he can be at ease with us. Bairuoxi is good in everything, but he is too simple. If the special physique like Tiansheng looting is noticed by those vixens in the outside world, it is obvious that they will desperately pursue it and want to make Tiansheng looting their own thing. How could Muzian, a young and energetic boy, withstand such temptation? However, she couldn't let him have an ambiguous relationship with other girls. Just accept the inheritance with peace of mind. I will handle this matter properly," the Sword Palace Master said. Bairuoxi hesitated after hearing this and said, "What are you going to do?" The Sword Palace Master did not answer directly, but just drew a very beautiful arc at the corner of his mouth and said, "I have my own plan. She needs to sleep in the scabbard for a while. If she can be nourished by the Tiansheng furnace during this period, Bairuoxi can enter the return to Void Realm as soon as possible and wake up from her sleep. But if he is allowed to return to Lianji section, he probably won't be able to be with Tiansheng furnace every day. After all, according to Bairuoxi's memory, Muzian has quite a few confidants around him. But if he is allowed to stay in the Sword Palace, there won't be so many troubles." The Sword Palace Master stared deeply at a certain direction in the Sword Palace, as if she saw a young man in the hall through countless stone walls. Then, she suddenly seemed to notice something, and subconsciously turned her head to look in a certain direction. There were actually people besides herself who were secretly spying on him. The Sword Palace Master's eyes flickered slightly, staring at the direction of the Lianji section. The next moment, a girl in a purple skirt appeared in her field of vision. As if she had noticed someone's peeping, Ye Lingxian also slowly opened her star-like purple eyes and turned her head slightly to look at the puppet beside her. "What happened?" she asked softly. The reincarnated queen explained what had just happened, from her secret surveillance and protection of Muzian to what was noticed by the Sword Palace Master. "What should we do next?" "Continue to stare at him," the puppet asked. Ye Lingxian turned her head slightly to look at the puppet beside her and smiled brightly. "Keep watching. If anyone wants to do something bad, use this child to bring Brother Mu back." The chain of desolate time poked its head out from her sleeve, seeming to be ready to move. Time passed silently, and 3 days passed unknowingly. During these 3 days, Lin Qiu and others had adventures in the Sword Palace, and discovered spiritual mines in several places in succession. After injecting spiritual stones, they unlocked the formation of the spiritual mines and obtained some special medicinal materials in the Sword Palace. Although it was painful, it was not unacceptable for the descendants of these ancient families. After all, some medicinal materials and even the prescriptions for elixirs in the Sword Palace could not be bought with spiritual stones in the outside world. It should be said that he is worthy of being a descendant of an ancient family. As expected, his foundation is sufficient. Even the spiritual stones he carries with him are more than 1 million. Musian played with the special spiritual stone in his hand and couldn't help but sigh from the bottom of his heart. At this time, various special spiritual stones have been piled up in front of the magic circle. Some are emerald green, while others are enchanting red. These are special spiritual stones, and they are quite valuable. Among them, Musian even saw a special spiritual stone that was translucent. In this translucent spiritual stone, you can also see a wisp of golden silk, shining with a faint crystal luster. Aurora crystal. This is a special spiritual stone that only exists in the restricted area. At the beginning, someone used this thing to exchange for Nirvana silk with the Saint of Yaokai, but in the end, Nirvana silk was still snatched by Musian. This person's identity seems to be very extraordinary. He can even produce the Aurora crystal. Musian exclaimed in his heart. For special spiritual stones like the Aurora crystal, more cultivators will not choose to trade them, but will make them into necklaces and give them to important people around them. At present, there are 3 Aurora crystals, and judging from the size, they are enough to make 6 identical Aurora necklaces. Musian picked out the 3 Aurora crystals, and then thought for a moment, and picked out several special spiritual stones suitable for making necklaces from the formation. Thinking carefully, it has been a long time since I gave gifts to the fishes, and occasionally I should let them feel my enthusiasm. Counting the 13 spiritual mines wasted by Sister Menro, this harvest is quite rich. Musian sighed again in his heart, and then looked at the cold and long-legged yellow-skirted maid beside him with a little strangeness. Not long ago, he asked Wei Mengru to cut 13 spiritual ores, and the result was that without exception, every spiritual ore was only air after being cut. Even if Musian picked a spiritual ore and asked Wei Mengru to cut it, there was only air inside. It can only be said that the maid is not suitable for playing this kind of game. As if she noticed Musian's gaze, Wei Mengru glanced at him lightly. "What are you looking at?" "It's okay, I just think that Sister Mengru's luck seems to be a little too bad." Musian smiled. Wei Mengru turned her face away silently, leaving only a snow-white and beautiful side profile to Musian, and her red lips opened slightly. "It's just a coincidence." She said so, but she was obviously still very unconfident, and even at the end she couldn't help but droop her eyes slightly, worried about gains and losses. After cutting 13 spiritual ores in a row, there was nothing inside. Even a fool could know that it was not that there was nothing in the spiritual ore, but that there was a big problem with her luck. "It's okay. Even if Sister Mengru doesn't have any spirit stones, I will still support you in the future." Musian spoke to comfort the maid. Wei Mengru glanced at him with disdain, and a teasing arc appeared at the corner of her mouth. "Rely on others to support your spirit stones. Do you mean I can use my own spirit stones?" Musian found a blind spot. Wei Mengru. After a short silence, Wei Mengru gave Musian a disdainful look again, and then curled her lips. "Just playing tricks. How many spirit stones did you collect this time?" She changed the topic. "A rough estimate should be more than 3 million spirit stones." When Musian said this, he couldn't help but smile. Even he was a little surprised by the harvest this time. Although he knew that these ancient families had a deep foundation, he was still a little surprised that they could invest so many spirit stones in these spirit mines at once. It seems that the temptation of the first-grade technique is indeed very great, and they are willing to pay any price. Musian sighed. It's just a pity that the first-grade technique in the Sword Palace is not in those spiritual mines. In the final analysis, even if the first-grade technique is found, no one can learn it. Because the technique was created by the Sword Palace master, and the first condition for learning it is to be able to control 108 lightsabers. This requirement alone has screened out 99% of the people. But of course, Musian is not a black-hearted businessman, and he will not cheat these genius cultivators of too many spiritual stones. Except for the emperor-level medicinal materials, he did not take away all the other things, but left some in those spiritual mines. In general, these immortal opportunities are what those genius cultivators can get, but after processing, Musian became a middleman and took away their spiritual stones. More than 3 million spirit stones, if used purely for cultivation, I'm afraid I can soar to the 4th level of soul refining in a short period of time, Musian exclaimed in admiration, and then put these special spirit stones into the storage ring. However, after storing nearly 1 million spirit stones, he soon encountered a new problem. The storage space of the storage ring is not enough. Sister Mengru, can you lend me your storage ring first? Musian tried to discuss it with Wei Mengru. However, Wei Mengru just shook her head slightly and said, my storage ring is already full. Generally speaking, storage rings are also divided from the 9th grade to the 1st grade. The later the grade, the more things can be stored. If it is a 1st grade storage ring, it can even store a person in it. Musian's 8 Desolate Dream Map actually has a similar effect, but if special spirit stones are stored in it, those spirit stones will be immediately swallowed by the 8 Desolate Dream Map, because this technique can evolve. Its way of evolution, in addition to working day and night for fairies or other Yokai saints, is to use spirit stones to feed the 8 Desolate Dream Map. But just one evolution requires an amount of spirit stones beyond people's imagination, so Musian naturally did not consider it for the time being. I didn't expect to be stumped by a small storage ring. Musian fell into a brief contemplation. In the end, Musian decided to take all the remaining special spirit stones that could not be put into the storage ring and feed the 8 Desolate Dream Map. Then he continued to patiently fish, watching the slowly growing special spirit stones in the hall, and felt quite a sense of accomplishment. Half a day passed unknowingly, and the speed at which those special spirit stones emerged in the formation modified by Musian also slowed down a lot. This also means that the spiritual stones carried by the descendants of the ancient families should have been almost consumed. It seems that we can prepare to pack up and send them away. Musian looked at the dazzling array of special spiritual stones in front of him, with a thoughtful look in his eyes. Just as Musian guessed, after more than 3 days of exploration in the Sword Palace, everyone's spiritual stones had been squeezed out almost completely, but everyone's face was not very unhappy, but rather quite satisfied with the harvest of this trip. Although it was a pity that they could not open a 1st grade technique from the spiritual mine in the end, at least some medicinal materials of the Sword Palace were found, and some people even got a 2nd grade technique. Overall, it was not a loss. However, after entering the Sword Palace this time, 3 people died, and 2 people from Ganyuan Pavilion were trapped in it by Musian's suspected magic weapon. If this matter were to be spread, it would probably cause quite a stir. After all, Gan Chen of Ganyuan Pavilion is a genius that everyone in Ganyuan Pavilion is looking forward to, and his cousin is also a well-known force in Dongzhou. Of course, this matter has nothing to do with them. Another day passed unknowingly. On this day, when they noticed that the Sword Palace seemed to be emitting an extremely dangerous aura, everyone remembered what the Sword Palace master had said before, so they left the Sword Palace with their gains. On the other side, Lin Qiu followed behind everyone, pretending to leave, but after watching them leave the Sword Palace, she turned around and planned to go back to find Musian. At this time, Ye Yu's voice suddenly came from behind, with a faint smile on his face, saying, Miss Lin, do you need me to take you back? I see that you seem to have consumed a lot of spiritual energy in the past few days. It may not be safe to go back alone. Lin Qiu looked at this disciple of Lianji sect with a little surprise, as if he was a little surprised that he knew her physical condition. Because she had just been seriously injured, Her physical condition was not very good. If it weren't for the Huiwen pill that saved her life, she might have fainted by now. Of course, although she was surprised, Lin Qiu still shook her head and refused in a reserved and cold manner, "Don't bother, Mr. Yet. The Sword Palace is not too far from my Swanyan Palace, and I am used to traveling alone." Seeing this, Yu frowned slightly, with a bit of regret in his eyes. If you miss a beauty like Lin Qiu this time, it will probably be difficult to get another chance, and according to rumors, the Swanyan body can even benefit dual practitioners. But the other party is the apple of the eye of the master of the Swanyan Palace. No matter how dissatisfied he is, you can't say anything at this moment. He can only bow his hands and fly away immediately. Although he lost nearly 500,000 spirit stones this time, it is not too bad, at least he got 2 6th-grade medicinal herbs. Thinking about his own gains, and then thinking about Musian who disappeared after pulling out the bronze sword, Yu felt a kind of happiness in his heart. Warm reminder, if you find that clicking the next page will force you to jump to other websites, please use the chapter error or contact us at the bottom to inform us. We will deal with it as soon as possible. Thank you for your understanding. At that time in the mysterious hall, after Musian pulled out the bronze sword, his spiritual energy was obviously disordered. I think he should have fainted later. This time, everyone got a lot of gains in the Sword Palace, only Musian went there in vain. Even if the Sword Palace disappears after this, he might disappear with the Sword Palace. Just thinking of this, Yu felt a little more carefree in his heart, holding the 6th-grade medicinal materials in his hand tightly, with a bit of fiery meaning in his eyes. He wanted to use these 2 6th-grade medicinal materials to refine pills that can speed up cultivation, so that he can prepare for the Ascension Conference. On the other side, after watching everyone leave, Lin Qiu's beautiful eyes flickered, and she was about to turn around and return to the Sword Palace. However, as soon as she turned around, she saw the young man who saved her walking slowly towards here. He handed an ordinary ring to Lin Qiu and said with a smile, "Miss Qiu, these are the special spirit stones you consumed in the spirit mine before. Please calculate the number to see if there is any mistake." The cold attitude just now disappeared silently, and Lin Qiu smiled brightly, "No need to calculate, I believe in you." Musian pondered for a moment and said, "I'll take you back. Or are you used to walking alone?" When he said this, there was a hint of ridicule in his tone, obviously because he had just heard the conversation between Yu and Lin Qiu. Lin Qiu was stunned at first, and then soon knew what Musian meant by what he said just now. She pursed her plump lips and rolled her eyes at him, which was quite playful like a girl. The two of them were chatting, and unknowingly left the Sword Palace and flew to the direction of the Swanyan Palace. By the way, I don't know what the young master's name is. Lin Qiu suddenly remembered this. At that time, she was being chased and killed in an emergency, so she had no chance to ask the other party's name at all, and only remembered this matter now. However, among the disciples of Lianji sect, there are not many who can suppress 2 cultivators in the 3rd level of soul refining. When Lin Qiu was thinking about this, she suddenly heard a familiar name in her ear. She was slightly stunned, and then subconsciously glanced at the boy beside her. Musian. Lin Qiu's eyes were filled with surprise. Swanyan Palace. The master of Swanyan Palace seemed to have known that his daughter had returned, and had been waiting in front of the palace. When he saw the boy beside her, the master Lin Jing raised his eyebrows slightly, as if he was a little surprised. His daughter actually came back with a cultivator of the opposite sex? And she only went to the Sword Palace for a few days? Dad. Lin Qiu stepped on delicate and small embroidered shoes and walked into the palace with lotus steps. Lin Jing put his hands behind his back, glared at his daughter, and said unhappily, "Are you willing to come back?" Lin Qiu playfully stuck out her tongue, obviously knowing her problem. Lin Jing's eyes fell on Musian again, with a bit of doubt in his eyes, and he said, "Who is this young friend?" Although he had heard of Musian's name, Lin Jing had never seen this person before, so it was no wonder that he didn't recognize a living person standing in front of him at this time. I am Musian. I happened to meet Lin Qinjin in the Sword Palace this time. Many things happened, so I came back with her, Musian said respectfully with a fist. Musian. Lin Jing's eyes moved slightly, and then he looked at his daughter strangely. Didn't Lin Qiu run away from home this time because she opposed his unauthorized proposal of marriage? As a result, after running to the Sword Palace, she met the person she proposed to. And from this point of view, his daughter obviously has a good impression of him. For a moment, even the helmsman of the top forces in Dongzhou didn't know what to say. As if she couldn't stand Lin Jing's meaningful gaze, Lin Qiu suddenly said, "Dad, the reason I met Master Mu this time is actually because..." Under Lin Jing's gaze, Lin Qiu roughly explained what happened in the Sword Palace, and when he heard the end, Lin Jing was unexpectedly calm. Those two evil beasts dared to attack Qiu, it must not be their own idea, and other forces must be involved, Lin Jing said slowly. Then, his eyes fell on Musian and said, "Friend Mu, can I handle those two people?" Musian nodded slightly, and threw Gan Chen and the other two out of the 8 desolate dream map together. The two hadn't even reacted yet, but when they saw Musian, they were extremely angry at the first time, and their spiritual energy burst out. Humph. At this time, Lin Jing snorted coldly, and a big hand slapped down from the void, suppressing the two directly. Then, he looked up at Musian, his eyes softened a lot, and said, "I will handle this matter properly, and will not cause any trouble to you, young friend Mu. If you don't mind, you can stay in my Swanyan Palace for a few days, and I will have someone treat you well." Musian was not very interested in the intrigues between these big forces, so he raised his hands and bowed, saying, "Junior will have other things to deal with later, so I'm afraid I have to leave first." Lin Jing heard this, although he wanted to keep him, but seeing that Musian was determined to leave, he had to let Lin Qiu send him off. The two walked on the square in front of the hall. The cold winter wind blew. Lin Qiu's silk dress fluttered in the wind, and her hair was messy. She turned her head and looked at Musian, and said softly, "Mr. Mu, are you really not going to stay for 2 days? I haven't thanked you for your kindness this time." Musian shook his head and smiled, "There will be a chance next time. I do have something important to do this time, so there is no way." Lin Qiu's eyes were a little disappointed, but she hid it well in her heart. Unconsciously, the two left the hall soon. Musian raised his hands and clasped his fists and said, "Miss Qiu, you don't have to see me off. Just stop here." Lin Qiu opened her red lips slightly, looking at Musian's leaving figure, and wanted to say something. For her, Musian's appearance and departure were like a dream. The time they spent together was not long, but Musian left a very good impression on her, and the mysterious feeling on him was also quite attractive. For a girl who had a fantasy of a pink romance, Musian met all the characteristics of her Taoist partner. However, the two of them could only be called casual friends now, and the shy girl naturally felt embarrassed to ask for him to stay. At this time, Musian paused slightly, turned around, and said with a smile, "By the way, Miss Qiu also helped me a lot this time, and I should give you some rewards." Under Lin Qiu's gaze, he handed a very beautiful aurora crystal to her. "I wanted to give her a necklace, but unfortunately it's too late to process it. Miss Qiu can take it and process it herself. This aurora crystal can also be used for some blessing during daily cultivation." Lin Qiu's eyes moved slightly, looking at the aurora crystal in her hand, and subconsciously glanced at Musian, and whispered, "This should be able to make 2 necklaces." Musian pondered for a moment, looking at Lin Qiu's delicate and beautiful features, and the peach blossom eyes that gazed at him, revealing a spring breeze smile. "Will you also participate in the Ascension Conference in a while?" Lin Qiu hesitated for a moment, but still nodded gently. Then wait until you ask someone to make a necklace, and then send me another one after you come to the sect in a while." Musian smiled. Linkia was slightly stunned, and then lowered her eyes slightly. "Okay." After leaving Swanyan Palace, Musian returned to the Sword Palace in a good mood. In the hall, he admired the 2 emperor-level medicinal herbs he had taken not long ago, and patiently waited for the inheritance from Bairuoxi to end. Each emperor-level medicinal herb takes 10,000 years to grow, and even the strong men in the Hedeo realm are reluctant to take it directly. If you can understand the mystery, it will be of great benefit to the cultivators. The Sword Palace Master is really a rich lady. She even gave me this thing directly. It makes me feel a little embarrassed to eat soft rice." Musian looked at the purple petals of one of the emperor-level medicinal herbs, and couldn't help but sighed from the bottom of his heart. A day later, the sharp blade of light outside the Sword Palace had completely dimmed, and in the depths of the Sword Palace, the curtain blew silently, making the Sword Palace Master's beautiful face particularly moving. On this day, there was a slight vibration in the hall. When Musian noticed a familiar breath coming from the depths of the Sword Palace, he subconsciously looked over and saw the Sword Palace Master in a dark white dress walking towards him. Musian immediately stood up and greeted her. After glancing at her chest, he confirmed that she was the Sword Palace Master and not Bairuoxi. Musian couldn't help but ask doubtfully, "Is the inheritance not over yet? If the Sword Palace inheritance is over, shouldn't the Palace Master be asleep? Or did something unexpected happen to the inheritance?" Musian continued to ask. The Sword Palace Master shook her head and smiled. "The inheritance is over." Behind her, there seemed to be a gorgeous golden lightsaber floating. It was formed by the fusion of 108 lightsabers. As long as she raised her fingertips, the golden lightsaber could be divided into thousands of sword blades. "Then why aren't you sleeping yet?" Musian complained in his heart. As if guessing what Musian was thinking, the Sword Palace Master smiled and said, "I still have something to talk to you about." "Palace Master, just say it," Musian said. The Sword Palace Master casually played with a strand of hair, raised his eyes and stared at Musian, and said, "Do you want to consider staying in the Sword Palace for a while?" Musian was stunned at first, then immediately reacted, shook his head and smiled. "Palace Master, you are joking. The Ascension Conference will be held in a while, and I am worried that if I don't go back, some friends in the sect will worry about me. The Sword Palace Master smiled and said softly, "If you are talking about someone like my sister, I have already told them a few days ago." Musian was slightly stunned. "You, who did you tell?" "I noticed that there was a mysterious strong man spying on you in secret, so I took the opportunity to explain it to her." The Sword Palace Master smiled charmingly. "Mysterious strong man? Kingdi? Or, the puppet sister next to Ye Lingxian? It's a puppet differentiated from a powerful person in the Hedeo realm. In the past, people called her the reincarnated queen." The Sword Palace Master smiled. Musian hesitated for a moment, and then as if he remembered something, his eyes slowly widened a little. "Have you told Lingxian?" "I mentioned this to her puppet." When the Sword Palace Master said this, he raised his hand and gently stroked Musian's handsome face. "What do you think about staying in the Sword Palace for a while, Mu Lang?" At this moment, her voice seemed to have become as gentle and pleasant as Bairuoxi's voice, pleasant to the ears, and there was a kind of magic that made people's eyes involuntarily attracted to it. Musian wanted to refuse, but when he raised his head, he only saw a pair of mean hearts and the gentle gaze of the Sword Palace Master. So big and white. Musian hesitated for a while, but never refused. Thinking about it carefully, it would be okay to stay in the Sword Palace until the Ascension Conference begins, right? Anyway, there are less than 10 days left before the Ascension Conference begins. If I can feel the heart of the Sword Palace Master in these 10 days, then it will be a great profit. The Sword Palace Master's mouth curled up slightly, outlining a very beautiful arc, it seems that you don't have any opinions, so let's decide. Before the voice fell, the Sword Palace Master seemed to have noticed something, and subconsciously turned his head to look in a certain direction outside the Sword Palace. There seemed to be a faint sound of chains colliding with each other in the hall. Whoosh! The ancient atmosphere filled the hall, and then a chain suddenly stretched out from the void, and the golden chain was directly wrapped around Musian's wrist. Then, a pleasant voice sounded lightly in the hall, "Sorry, if he has to stay somewhere, he should go back to the restricted area with me, instead of staying in the Sword Palace." The Sword Palace Master stared at the golden chain coming from the void, and inadvertently narrowed her beautiful eyes. Lock of Desolate Time. So, they were the protagonists all along. Author, CCC. Chapter 251. The chain of desolate time forcibly split the space, forming a bottomless void. From the void, Ya Lingxian walked slowly with the reincarnated queen doll beside her, who looked extremely beautiful but was so cold that it seemed to freeze people. As if she had noticed Musian's gaze, Ya Lingxian also stared at him. After a few seconds, a slight arc appeared at the corner of her mouth, and she grabbed the chain of desolate time in front of her sleeves and suddenly pulled it. Whoosh! The next moment, Musian seemed to be about to enter the void with the chain of desolate time. Clang! However, at this time, the Sword Palace Master raised his hand and made a gesture, and the lightsaber behind him turned into dozens of golden lightsabers and fell from mid-air, forcibly piercing the chain of desolate time on the ground, stopping Ya Lingxian's plan to end T.R in front of her. Ya Lingxian didn't seem surprised. She gently jumped down from the void, and her thin and fluffy skirt suddenly bloomed into a circle, like a blooming flower. The Sword Palace Master never spoke, but stared at the girl who suddenly came to the Sword Palace, and the emotionless woman beside her. The woman was wearing a loose white single garment and a white chest wrap. Although she was cold and emotionless, she added a bit of cold beauty because of her looming appearance. This reincarnated queen never spoke, but the Sword Palace Master knew that this woman was the biggest opponent. Although it was just a puppet without emotions, it was already powerful enough to reach the state of harmony. In the final analysis, this puppet itself represented one of the lives of the reincarnated queen, so its strength should not be underestimated. As for the girl beside the puppet, she should not be ignored either. Ya Lingxian's strength was not a big threat to the Sword Palace Master now, but the ancestral artifact in her hand and even her own charm were great threats to her. As if she had sensed the sight of the Sword Palace Master, Ya Lingxian put her hands behind her back, raised her head and smiled. "Sister Ruoxi, if I remember correctly, you told me before that we are not enemies, right? Why do you suddenly regret it now and plan to keep Brother Mu in the Sword Palace?" When Ya Lingxian said this, she looked at the woman in front of her with doubt. From the dress and even the temperament, the beauty in front of her seems to be different from Bai Ruoxi. Bai Ruoxi is more like a weak and cold young lady, while the beauty in front of her has a more dignified temperament, and she feels like a queen leaning on the throne, high above. If the only thing that remains unchanged is probably the breast volume, that is enough to look down on other women. Ya Lingxian couldn't help but frowned and stared at the Sword Palace Master. "No. You are not Sister Ruoxi, I should call you Sister Palace Master." The Sword Palace Master raised her eyebrows and smiled. "You can call me whatever you like." She paused and continued, "Compared to this, Sister Lingxian suddenly visited the Sword Palace without saying a word. Is there something important?" Ya Lingxian smiled. "If I have to say it, it's nothing, but Brother Mu and I had an agreement earlier that after my inheritance is over, he will leave with me." The Sword Palace Master exuded a sense of majesty that people dared not look up at, but when Ya Lingxian stood in front of her, she was not suppressed at all, and her pair of gorgeous and bright eyes stared at the Sword Palace Master with a smile. Musian opened his mouth and thought to himself, "Can you help me untie this chain before chatting? Is this going to give me the whole sealed dark mage scene?" Just when the chain of desolate time was tied to Musian's wrist, the Sword Palace Master also quietly summoned the heart chain and tied it to Musian's other wrist, as if she was worried that Musian would be taken away directly by Lingxuan's chain of desolate time. The Sword Palace Master did not intend to compromise. Her eyes flickered slightly, and she said softly, "Is there any misunderstanding between you and Mu Lang? He has already promised to stay in the Sword Palace with me for a while, how could he promise you anything?" Lingxian tilted her head in confusion and said, "It should be Sister Ruoxi who has a relationship with Brother Mu. Sister Palace Master is a senior who will live forever. Why would she want to keep Brother Mu in the Sword Palace?" She deliberately emphasized the tone of the word senior to mock the Sword Palace Master for being an old cow eating young grass. The Sword Palace Master smiled brightly, "In a sense, Ruoxi and I are the same person, just two different spiritual consciousnesses in one body. Besides, he just promised me that he would be with you later." Musian's forehead was sweating coldly, and he hurriedly said, "Palace Master, I still have a lot of things to deal with in Lianji sect, and I made an appointment with someone when I got the second bronze piece, and I need to keep the appointment as soon as possible." "Did you get the second bronze fragment from someone else?" the Sword Palace Master asked in confusion. Musian nodded slightly, "I made a deal with her that day, and I plan to keep the appointment after the Sword Palace trip, so." The Sword Palace Master looked at her gently and smiled, "So you plan to accompany Sister Lingxian back to Lianji sect?" Musian shook his head and said softly, "Let's wait until your inheritance is over, and then go back together. The inheritance is over, and I will fall asleep in the scabbard in a while," the Sword Palace Master replied. "Since you are determined to return to Lianji sect, I will not stop you. After this, you can return to Lianji section," she continued. Musian was delighted, and was somewhat surprised that the Sword Palace Master actually agreed so straightforwardly, even though she was so strong not long ago. He thought that maybe she compromised because of Sister Lingxuan's presence, or maybe she got Ruoxi's memory, so she also felt sorry for her own Mu Lang and didn't want him to be too embarrassed. However, at this moment, he suddenly heard a voice in his ear, "When are you going to tell them so that you can be with me later?" Musian's eyes moved slightly, and his expression pretended to be calm, and he glanced at the Sword Palace Master inconspicuously. The Palace Master was wearing a dark black and white dress, which made her skin look white and crystal clear. There was a faint smile on the corner of her mouth, and her eyes gazed at him gently, with a bit of meaning in her eyes. "This mosasaur is still thinking about the fish in my pond. She is indeed different from Ruoxi, and has a strong possessiveness. However, during her sleep, let Ruoxi slowly get in touch with the fish. After the relationship is cultivated, the Palace Master will also have the same memory. After that, the relationship is in place, and he should no longer think about such things. Lingxian is my most beloved sister." The Palace Master misunderstood Musian sent a voice transmission. The Sword Palace Master obviously didn't believe it. "What about Yeqian?" "Qianer is a good girl, I always treat her as my sister. If I remember correctly, you also have a senior sister, and the relationship seems to be very close." The Sword Palace Master sent a voice transmission with tenderness and love. "Lan Murian is my most respected senior sister, and Sister Feiying is as kind to me as a neighbor sister. I only have a clear Taoist partner relationship with Ruoxi. Isn't this enough to explain something?" Musian sent a voice transmission again. From beginning to end, the Sword Palace Master never asked about Linglong and Fairy Yao Meng. Among all the opposite sex around Musian, Miss Linglong is the least threatening, because Lin Ling is a foodie, and eating is far more important than anything else. And Yao Meng, Ruoxi may have guessed that there is some relationship between Musian and Yao Meng, but it is just a guess. "I hope that next time I wake up, you can return to the Sword Palace with me, otherwise I will be very embarrassed." The Sword Palace Master softly transmitted the message. It's not that she doesn't want to keep Musian in the Sword Palace, but now her consciousness is getting more and more tired, and she is slowly going to sleep. The personality of the palace master and Ruoxi seems to be just the opposite. Although Ruoxi is a little sick, it doesn't seem to be so exaggerated, although the sword palace master reluctantly compromised, and there was tenderness in her eyes when she looked at herself. Musian's back was sweating. The sword palace master slowly closed his eyes, as if he was gradually falling asleep and exchanging bodies with Ruoxi. And the heart lock on Musian's right hand was quietly unlocked. At this time, the chain of desolate time suddenly quietly pulled Musian and brought him to Yelingsuan's side. Then, the chain of desolate time enveloped the two of them, forming a light golden halo. What were Brother Mu talking about with Sister Palace Master just now? It seems that you were communicating with each other. Yelingsuan's pleasant voice like a lark came from the side, and she looked at Musian with curiosity. Sister Lingsuan's awareness of anti-gang seemed to be getting stronger and stronger. Musian smiled and said, I just discussed it with the senior, and she has agreed to let me return to the section. As he said that, he tried to remove the chain of desolate time from his wrist without making a sound, but this thing not only did not show any signs of loosening, but it was even more tightly bound. This thing is really difficult to deal with. I have to think of a way in the future, otherwise if I get entangled by the chain of desolate time, I won't even be able to run away. Musian thought to himself. But having said that, it is too difficult to unlock the shackles of the desolate time lock. Because this ancestral artifact involves time, for example, at this moment, the speed of time passing in the area centered on the desolate time lock is obviously much slower than the outside world. Yelingxian frowned slightly, glanced at the tall palace-dressed beauty in front of her, and snorted, Brother Mu should decide where to go by yourself, why do you have to discuss it with her? When she said this, she bit her lower lip lightly, obviously jealous. When confirming that the sword palace master still had his eyes slightly closed, Musian took the courage to hold Yelingsuan's slightly cold and soft little hand tightly with one hand. Yelingxian blushed, and glared at Musian with resentment, saying, This is the sword palace, can't Brother Mu be more considerate of the occasion? If I hadn't seen you getting so jealous that you were almost blackened, I wouldn't have taken such a risk in front of the palace master. Musian said softly, Is your inheritance over? Didn't you say it would take more than half a month? How come it's only been a few days? Yelingxian let Musian hold her hand. She looked at the sword palace master who was standing not far away with his eyes slightly closed, and said, The desolate time lock can rewrite time, so the speed of inheritance cannot be estimated by normal time. Just refining the spirit realm can have such a great impact on time, Musian said in surprise. Yelingxian shook her head slightly, pointed to the woman next to her and said, In most cases, the desolate time lock is used by her first. Not far from Yelingxian, a tall beauty wearing a loose white lingerie and with a cold and indifferent temperament stood quietly on one side. She never spoke, as if she had no feelings. Is this the puppet you made before? This puppet is really convenient. Musian exclaimed. Actually, she also has feelings, so Brother Mu, please don't keep staring at her. If she is annoyed, I will not save you. Yelingxian reminded her intentionally or unintentionally, with dissatisfaction in her tone. Obviously, Musian still prefers the charming imperial sister to the charming little beauty, so just now he looked at the delicate body of the reincarnated queen intentionally or unintentionally. Dolls also have feelings, Musian was a little surprised. Some dolls even have all the emotions of human beings. It just depends on how the strong people in the Hedeo realm set them up when they were created, Yelingxian said. Musian suddenly realized. Then, he suddenly changed the subject, shall we go back to the sect in a moment? Since your inheritance is over, from now on you just need to meditate and practice with peace of mind and prepare for the Immortal Ascension Conference. You all listen to Brother Mu. Yelingxian looked over with bright eyes, delicate features and a slight smile on her face, looking like a good and obedient sister. However, at this time, The reincarnated queen, who had remained silent, suddenly spoke, "Her inheritance is not over yet." Before Musian came to his senses, the woman continued, "The spiritual energy of the ninth life is in your natural furnace. The inheritance will not be completed until you hand over the spiritual energy to her." Speaking of which, the reincarnated queen stored the spiritual energy of one of her lives in my natural furnace. Could it be that Sister Lingxian came to me today for this reason? Ya Lingxian glared at the woman next to her in annoyance and said, "Stop talking." After finishing speaking, he looked up at Musian again, with a hint of shame and eagerness in his shining eyes, and hurriedly explained, "Brother Mu, she is just talking nonsense, don't listen to her." Musian's eyes moved slightly, and he subconsciously looked at the girl next to him, but he only saw that the girl who had acted calm just now was now burning with shame. Compared with the previous calm and elegant look, she was now even more, it exudes the charm of a little beauty. He quickly came to his senses, smiled and nodded, "Yes, I understand, I understand. The strong men in the Hedeo realm are talking nonsense, and the reincarnated queen who knows the best about Ye Lingxuan's current inheritance progress is talking nonsense. Even a fool will not believe this explanation of Sister Lingxian." However, as a qualified fish pond owner, he naturally had to take care of Ye Lingxuan's face at this moment. After all, this little girl was thin-skinned. If she was shocked now, how could he return the spiritual energy of the ninth life to her? Although she behaves calmly on weekdays, in the final analysis, Ye Lingxian is just a girl with little experience in relationships. Her strength and talent are certainly top-notch, but, when it comes to relationships, Mr. Mu is top-notch. Feeling the slow passage of time, he looked at Biruoxi, who had her eyes slightly closed not far away, and said, "Let's go back to the sect after Ruoxi wakes up." Musian quietly put one hand around Ye Lingxuan's slender waist from behind, looking sideways at the girl's innocent and shy face. "As for other things, let's wait until later."